Before I begin, I do want to let y'all know that this is part B in the ERS part 4 series, so just want to make it clear, if you haven't watched part A, highly recommend watching part A. I'll link it in the description for y'all. So with that, let's move on to the second semester of the school year, being January 22nd. In parts 1, 2, and 3, semesters weren't really that important since all my classes, other than labs from 7th grade, were a year long. But starting in 8th grade, I would occasionally have semester-long classes, meaning new classes would begin in January. I had 3 new classes this semester. Let's get to them. The first one was Accelerated 8th grade Science. This was our replacement for World History, so this was my new first block. Anyways, 8th grade is a very important year for science since 8th graders take an EOG for science, alongside math and English. Unlike the math and English EOG, which is given to every North Carolina student from grades 3 through 8, science EOGs are only administered to 5th and 8th graders. In 6th and 7th grade, students take an NCFE similar to the one we took for World History. For those who haven't seen part 1, I'll explain the difference between these tests near the end of the story time when I talk about the end of year exams. For now, let's stay on the topic of 8th grade science. Now, our class was a little bit different from the other teams since the other teams had science for the entire school year. But since we took World History, we only had 1 semester to cover this material, which wasn't too bad since this class wasn't that hard outside of one particular thing that I'll discuss in February. Anyways, the teacher for this course was really sweet. I have a really big soft spot for her, and I'll explain why when we get to March. But for now, she was just a really sweet and down-to-earth teacher. We as a class made fun of her quite a bit since she's from Western Pennsylvania, which is a region of the state that says yens, which is the equivalent of us down south saying y'all. And even though this was her second year teaching in North Carolina, she was still trying to get used to the culture down here, so we also did get to help her out there. Additionally, she was also kind of getting back into the swing of teaching, since she had a baby in 2017, so this was a rough semester for her as well. But despite going through these challenges, she did very well. She kind of did something similar to how our World History intern did with making her class more hybrid. And that worked really well since we were all of course used to the hybrid format. Therefore, I was able to do surprisingly well in this class. Another new class that I was taking this semester was Art, which was my replacement for Spanish. Art was a really fun and very relaxing class, which at first I was a little scared about since I'm not a good artist. I explained this very well in part 2, where I talked about that art project I did where I drew a horse getting its asshole rammed into by a taxi and people actually buying my merchandise with my artwork. I almost cried laughing about that in that story time in part 2, so definitely recommend watching it because that just might be the funniest story I've ever told in my 2.5 years of doing story time. Unfortunately, while I didn't draw this again or something similar, I still had a fun time in this class. Our teacher was really chill with us and let us mostly do our own thing. Additionally, 2 of my friends were in this class, so that also provided time to talk to them. Only problem though was that Sir was also in this class, and of course, being Sir, he took any opportunity he could to degrade me. In April, we would do something especially shitty that I'll discuss when we get there. Now, my third new class was really interesting, as it was the first time I took a fully online class. So this class was Earth Environmental Science, a high school science course. This was an optional course for us to take. I personally did not want to take it, as I was already at a super low point and was already stressed enough. However, because I knew that my parents would get really mad at me for not signing up and call me lazy, I just signed up for it anyways. This was a terrible decision both short term and long term. Short term, it fucked my mental health even more, and I'll discuss why it was such a bad idea to take this class long term when we get to part 6. Now, in order to even take this class, we had to meet 3 conditions that really didn't make a whole lot of sense. The first condition was that we had to make an A in World History, which does make a little sense since this proves we can handle an online format, but still illogical before we weren't going to be doing history in a science class. The second one though made the absolute least sense, and that was the fact that we had to have made a 5 on our 5th grade science EOG. I don't know why this was required, because this was literally 3 years prior to us taking this class, but I think a better requirement would have been to have us made an A in 7th grade science, since that much more accurately reflected our potential at science at the time. And the third requirement did at least make full sense, and that was that we had to maintain A's and B's the first semester. But I did meet all these requirements, so I was eligible to take it, even if I didn't want to. As for the teacher, she was really nice and really cool, which is expected because my teacher for this class was my science Olympiad coach. So now I got to officially take a class under her. This was ironically my first of 2 classes I took under her, which I'll discuss my other class I took under her in part 7. And overall, this class wasn't too difficult. Well, learning material, taking the quizzes, and the exams weren't too hard, although the NCFE was a little different, which I'll get to at the end of the story time. But what was really difficult about this class were the labs. So for each unit, there were 2 labs we had to do. These were incredibly tough because we of course had to do these at home. As a result, for me to do a lab, I would have to ask my parents to buy some materials and then perform the lab, and I couldn't just bullshit them either, as we were required to take pictures of us doing the labs. I'd at least learn to work around at the end of the year and my teacher was perfectly fine with, but until then, these were absolutely dreadful. It's funny to think that the labs in this class were bad while the labs in 8th grade science were awesome. Weird how that worked. In part 8, I'll actually talk about a conversation I had with my Earth Environmental Science teacher regarding this class, since there was actually a unique issue she had that she revealed to me 4 years later. You'll then be able to kind of see why this course was difficult to work around for not just me, but for her as well. So those were my 3 new classes, and with 3 new classes meant even more stress and anxiety. Although to be fair, 8th grade science and art weren't that stressful since they were easy classes, it was mostly Earth Environmental Science that affected my mental health. But I do want to talk about my mental health here, as January was when depression started to get really serious. I wasn't suicidal quite yet, although that would come eventually, but it was starting to get to the point where depression was dominating my life. I'd say this started at the beginning of the semester, where I of course had to return to school to finish the second half of the school year, as well as take on more classes. Additionally, I had to go back to being bullied and back to my typical shitty life that I really hated. As a result, my RAFs became more and more violent and my grades also started to fall. I'll discuss my half of the quarter progress report that I received in February and how it really made me hate myself. I would also spend more time on Google Plus with the Dimperman community during this time, only hurting my mental health more and more as I got involved in more drama. It was during this time that I truly hated myself and thought I was the worst of the worst, and my feelings about myself only became more and more negative as time went on. Speaking of the Dimperman community, this would also be the month where I begin to see just how cruel people can be. Beginning this month, I would receive death threats from a YouTuber who attacked me for being friends with a girl he has had issues with since 2014. He sent me, her, and other allies of her multiple death threats and other downright despicable stuff. However, the Dimperman community still defended him, even them trying to claim that her screenshots were fake and this man was innocent, despite evidence of his threats literally being on YouTube. In fact, he even attacked me, that girl, and our friends in his videos, and yet the community still defended him and called us liars. As a result, my attitude towards myself started crumbling as I began feeling hopeless and believing that I somehow deserved these threats. Now, thankfully, the community would realize the monster this man was, and when he started turning on his friends. This resulted in him losing his friends, his YouTube channel, which was monetized at the time, his respect, and pretty much his life. This would not come until the summer of 2019, which was over a year after I left the community, and I'll discuss leaving the community when we get to March. But for now, this man was sending multiple death threats to me as well as to others. Thankfully, people started to realize just how awful this man was, but it would be too late because his threats already did enough damage to me. I'll discuss his downfall a little later in part 6. Alright, so let's move on to a more lighthearted discussion and talk about PE. Well, not exactly PE, but health. So the state requires all students to be CPR trained by the time they graduate high school. So they gave middle schoolers the chance to take CPR and become CPR certified in 8th grade. Well, some schools actually require 8th graders to take it, with my school being one of them. So, in January, we did a week-long CPR course, and by the end of the week, we were CPR certified. This was the second health session of the school year. Now, honestly, I do not remember anything I learned from this class. Like, even though I am CPR certified, I don't remember it whatsoever, and if someone near me was to have a heart attack, I wouldn't be able to do much other than call 911. However, I do remember a pretty funny story about a kid who got kicked out of this training for doing something really dumb. So we had a bunch of mannequins laying around to of course practice. However, one kid decided that he was going to get mad at a mannequin for no real reason other than as a joke, and as you could tell that his anger was in a joking way. So he picked up the mannequin and slammed it against the wall and shouted, "Fuck out of here!" Our teacher then came over and didn't even question him. He just said, "Alright, you're done. You failed CPR training. You'll have to take it at the high school. Get out of here. I'll also have you written up." What makes this even funnier is that this kid was completely dumbfounded. Like, he seriously thought that he did nothing wrong and tried to convince our teacher to let him stay. But our teacher was not convinced whatsoever. So that kid was kicked out while the rest of us laughed, including one kid who said, "What a dumbass." Perfect response, since this kid truly was a dumbass for not only doing this in the first place, but doing it in front of our teacher and trying to get out of it. Yeah, he definitely wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, and he's probably gotten smoother 5.5 years later. But that's all I really remember from CPR training. Let's move on to 8th grade science and talk about a super funny incident that happened during an experiment. So we were experimenting with mixtures, as we were doing our chemistry unit. So for this experiment, our teacher handed each table 3 bags. First bag was filled with baking soda. The second bag was filled with calcium chloride solution. And the third bag was a mixture of the 2 substances. We were then given 3 glasses of water, where we were to pour each glass into each bag. Now, we did this as a class, so we didn't immediately pour all cups of water into each bag. But when we did, one of us from each group would take turns shaking the bag, since that's what's needed to get a result. So let's discuss what happened to each bag. So for the baking soda bag, when we poured water and shook it, the bag became really cold. The solution didn't freeze, but it still became really cold and the bag started to get a little icy. The water was at room temperature, by the way, so the temperature of the water had no effect on the solution's temperature. Then we moved on to the calcium chloride solution. However, this time when we poured the water into the bag and shook it, the bag became really hot. Like, the group member at my table who was shaking this bag had to stop after only 5 seconds because the bag was really hot. Like, this thing was so hot it could cause first-degree burns. So we decided to just let our teacher take care of disposing of it since she had the tools to do so. Then came the baking soda and calcium chloride solution mixture. Now, before we begin, our teacher gave us a very stern warning not to shake this bag for more than 3 seconds. However, as she was giving this warning, a group member at the table next to mine had already started the experiment and was shaking the bag as hard as he could. And then a few seconds later, the bag and the stuff inside of it exploded all over him. While he didn't get any burns or frostbites, a white sticky liquid covered his whole body as we as a class began laughing. Thankfully, he wore goggles, so we did not get any of it in his eyes, but at least we got to see firsthand why we shouldn't shake the bag for too long, as if we did, we'd get what looked like a massive orgasm all over us. Once everyone calmed down, our teacher helped that poor kid out with the cleaning up, while we were all made sure to be extra careful with this experiment. And that pretty much wraps up January 2018. Very difficult month, as while it had its good moments, it was a super rough month for me. Let's move on to February 2018, an even more difficult month where I lived some of my worst days ever, although the absolute worst day wouldn't be until March. The main reason I lived some of the worst days of my life this month was, of course, because of my mental health. So, if my dip in mental health wasn't already bad enough in January, it would become super bad this month. So, near the beginning of the month, the bullies I sat with at lunch decided to try a different technique with regards to bullying me. They decided that they were going to move tables and let me sit alone and embarrass me in front of the entire school. So that's exactly what they did. They moved to the tables that would not let me sit with them and sat there, since they were allowed over there. As a result, I was now sitting at a table by myself in front of probably 200 students. Everyone else had a friend who they could sit beside and were welcome. Meanwhile, I was at a table by myself because I didn't share a second block with any of my friends. Which, by the way, the reason none of my friends were able to help me was because of that damn stupid ass fucking rule that required us to sit with our second block. The same dumbass rule that was set to prevent a situation like this literally caused this to happen. This just might have been the worst rule any school has ever imposed because it became the very thing it swore to fucking prevent. Now, you might be a little confused as to why this is such a big deal. In fact, you might think it's a good thing that the bullies left. Well, the truth of the matter is that because now, I was sitting by myself in front of 200 students. This was far worse than dealing with the bullies, because now I was left feeling hopeless and thinking nobody liked me, as well as wondering why I was the only one having to sit at a table by himself and dealing with depression, while everyone else got to be a normal kid and have fun. It just wasn't fair. It was as if I was not meant to be here. I felt as if I was a mistake and that if I was gone or had never been born, then the world would be a better place. It was at this moment that I officially became suicidal. Those thoughts I just told y'all were thoughts that I actually had and believed about myself during this time. I truly felt that I was the worst of the worst and that without me, the world would be a much better place. However, not even a few seconds after being suicidal, I started to crave blood. More specifically, my own blood. I had brought a pencil with me for that reason, and for some reason that day to lunch, so underneath the table, I drew my pencil as high as I could and then slammed it right into my left hand. This is the first of many times I harmed myself. I continued to do this throughout the rest of lunch while people stared at me, either not giving a fuck or laughing at me. Meanwhile, I wanted to die. Why the fuck couldn't I just be like everyone else? Why the fuck did I have to be born with autism? Why the fuck did I have to be the one that people step over and make fun of? Why the fuck do people think me throwing my raps at them was bad when they often did the same things or worse to me? Why the fuck did I have to spend 3 hours a night on algebra homework? Why the fuck did I have to be the one who gets sent death threats? Why the fuck do I have to be the center of drama that I didn't want to be involved in? Why the fuck couldn't I have friends? Why the fuck couldn't I just be a normal 8th grader that does 8th grade things? Why the fuck did I have to be the one with suicidal thoughts and now a self-harm addiction? In fact, why the fuck did mom and dad even choose to have me when I became this complete abomination to the world? These were all questions I asked myself during this time, although I never came up with an answer for them. However, the answer to these questions was actually a really simple one, and I will get the answer to those questions when we get to April. But this would be the moment that I started to idolize death and completely devalue my life. Every day, from then until the worst day of my life in March, I stabbed myself with the sharpest pencil I had and shedded more blood than I ever have. However, as my mental health began dipping into a place I had never been to, it also started to get more and more noticeable. From me never having any energy to do anything to my raps becoming the most violent they've ever been to my stress and anxiety being at an all-time high, people began to notice what was happening to me, and by people, I'm more referring to my teachers. Since the beginning of the year, they noticed a dive in my overall attitude and well-being. While one explanation could have been puberty, they noticed that my attitude and well-being were changing more and more quickly than what puberty usually does. In just a few months, I went from a happy, energetic, and hopeful boy to an angry, sentimental, unenergetic, and hopeless young man. It was pretty clear that something was wrong with me. And it was also made even more clear for them that they noticed that I was sitting at a table by myself, as well as some stab marks on my hand. It was also clear by my grades. During this time, I had a 75 in algebra and a 57 in Earth Environmental Science. For algebra, I was failing homeworks and quizzes, although this might be explained better by the fact that they were going over the hardest material in the course during this time. And in Earth Environmental Science, I was missing multiple labs as well as other assignments since I could barely get through it alongside everything else from my other classes. Therefore, they decided that something needed to be done. So, one day, my science teacher pulled me out of class to discuss it. She didn't really ask anything too deep, she just asked about my overall mood as well as told me her concerns. She also said that if I needed anything, I could talk to her and she'd be more than willing to listen. Then later that day while I was at PE, my teachers had a meeting with my parents. This is when they revealed their concerns about me to them and kind of let them know what was going on. My parents were unaware of really anything that was happening to me at the time since we barely spent much time together. Therefore, this kind of came to them as a shock. So, that night, my mom and dad both got out of work early and picked me up directly from school. I was a little confused about why until we got home, where we had what must have been a 4-hour conversation. The first started by asking if I was depressed, which I decided to be truthful with them and say that I was. They then asked about when it started and why it was happening and all this stuff. I sugarcoated it a ton, as while I mentioned being bullied, stressed out, and eating lunch by myself, I did not want to reveal that I was suicidal or harming myself. They never even saw the marks on my hand, so they didn't know that I was hurting myself. However, because I was purposely not telling them that I was suicidal, I did leave out some stuff. They were able to tell, and because my parents are very impatient, they got really mad at me. I still refused to tell them about my suicidal ideology, although they would learn about it a month later just before it was too late. But at least they gave up trying and the conversation ended. For the rest of the night, I stabbed myself until I was in so much pain that I passed out. The next day, my parents and teachers had another meeting, this time joined by my counselor. My parents explained what I told to the teachers and counselor, so now they knew that I was depressed, being bullied, and all the other factors. So later that day, the counselor came over and took me out of art to talk. I basically just re-explained the situation from my point of view and told her what all was going on. And just like with my parents, I didn't reveal that I was suicidal or harming myself. I just mentioned depression and being bullied. After telling her all this was going on, we proposed 3 solutions together. First solution was that during lunch, I would start sitting in a cubicle to the side of the cafeteria. This cubicle connected the principal's, vice principal's, and school resource officer's office. but it also had a little desk that I could sit and eat lunch in peace and away from everyone. I'll discuss how this went in a little bit. Second solution was a long-term goal, and that was considering early college. I expressed interest in enrolling in our county's prestigious early college high school program for high school during our conversation. This would be where I would obtain a high school diploma and an associate's degree while in high school for free. To attend this school, students have to apply, although it's a lottery. Therefore, only 25% of students get accepted here, but I was willing to apply and maybe miraculously, I would get accepted. So my counselor helped me fill out the application, sign a letter of recommendation, and then she sent it for me, meaning I was in the pool of applicants for the spot. I'll talk about what ultimately happened when we get to May. Third solution involved Mom getting in contact with the church leader. So starting every Tuesday after school, I would begin skipping swim practice in favor of seeing my church's discipleship pastor. He was a really cool guy, was very chill and very understanding of my situation. Every Thursday, I'd go to his house and we would lift weights together. That ended in late March though, as there'd be a pretty funny situation that resulted in me not being able to do physical activity for a little while. I'll explain that later. So those were the three solutions we discussed. She then discussed them with my teachers, whom all three were in support of, so starting that Monday, I began eating lunch in the cubicle. So let's talk about that cubicle. So it wasn't really anything too spectacular. I was now eating lunch by myself and away from my class as well as the whole table. The cubicle also had a one-way window, so I could see everyone enjoying their lunch. While I was glad that I was not sitting at my own table anymore, the solution honestly didn't do too much to make things better, as I hated myself and considered myself different from everyone. Seeing everyone having fun with each other, joking around, and having a good time made me feel left out and even worse about myself. Those questions from before often arose back in my head. Why couldn't I just be a normal 13-year-old boy and that dude does 13-year-old things? Why did I have to be the one dealing with mental illness and struggle to connect with peers? This went on for practically every day I sat in the cubicle, although I wouldn't be in the cubicle for too long before something happened that changed it. And the bullies also did not stop. While it wasn't as prevalent as it was during the months since before, I was no longer with the bullies since I was no longer with the bullies at lunch. It was still very common during other times throughout the day, especially in PE where the teachers didn't care. This would only drive me further insane, which of course would lead to what happened in March, and I'll discuss when we get there. Oh my god, that was a lot. I'm sorry if I went over the edge there, but this situation is one that really pisses me off. Even if it's been over 5.5 years since it happened. Like, even now at 19 years old, I'm still traumatized from like how the bullies treated me, the death threats I was sent online, the stress from the school year, and especially that one god-awful day from March. Writing the charm helped immensely with this, but I still have it and will endure this trauma for the rest of my life. I'll talk more about the long-term effects a little later. But for now, let's discuss that progress report I mentioned earlier. Now, throughout the series, I've never really mentioned grades since I always made high grades. Like, I mentioned rewards and stuff, but I never talked about progress reports or report cards since those have usually been irrelevant, as well as because I don't remember many of my quarterly grades pre-high school. However, this progress report in particular, I remember well. I had A's in all my classes except algebra and environmental science. As said before, I had a 75 in algebra and a 57 in earth environmental science. So when my parents saw this report card, they were absolutely livid. Now, you'll come to know that my parents were extremely strict regarding grades back when I was in school. They expected A's and high B's. If I brought home a low B, they wouldn't necessarily get mad, but they'd be very disappointed. Now, if I brought home a grade less than a C, they would be super mad and take away all of my electronics for an entire quarter. And if it was the end of the year, that meant the entire summer. Yeah, over a C. Now, for the record, they never did this to me because I've never made a C in my entire life, not even in college. After all, I am a very academically gifted person, but I know that they would do this because they did it to Zoe, as she's made a couple C's before. And what made this even dumber is that they did this for quarter grades. So if I made a C for the fourth quarter in a class but an A in the class overall, they'd still ground me because I made a C that last quarter. Yeah, it's a miracle I haven't burned out from academics. I guess that's because now I'm in college, they don't care about my grades, so I feel a little more relaxed and less stressed out about academics. But going back to 8th grade, when they saw my progress report, they were absolutely furious. They basically drilled it into me that I was lazy and I didn't care about my grades. They also talked a whole bunch of bullshit about how I wasn't doing anything and not focusing on schoolwork. which was completely stupid because they knew I was spending 3 hours on algebra homework a night. As a result, Mom began forcing me to spend my weekends studying and making up labs, since my teacher allowed for lab makeups. So for the next few weeks, I would have to do these rather than getting the much needed free time on weekends, which only further made me hate myself and made me want to die. Alright, well, I think that's enough discussion about mental health. Talking about the situation is never easy and gives me a good bit of melancholy. So how about we talk about some funny situations to cheer myself up a little bit. First situation I'll discuss happened on the bus on our way home, and it also inspired one of my favorite chapters from the charm. So the bus ride was going as it typically would. Although the kid who bullied me was not there, a girl who sat in the seat across from him decided to pick on me, since she was good friends with that bully. So she was picking on me, making fun of me, and saying some very rude and disgusting things to me. However, our bus driver made a super sharp turn and the bus ended up hitting a tree branch. This girl was dumb enough to have her window down, which I still can't process why she had it down since it was literally 55 degrees, so it was freezing cold. However, the tree branch ended up going right through her window and poked her really hard. The branch was also infested with bugs and other really dirty outdoor stuff, so on top of being really badly scratched by this thing, she also became super dirty as a ton of bugs called her hair their new home. The branch was only inside the bus for a few seconds, as once the bus got far enough away, the branch left the bus. Meanwhile, everyone nearby was checking up on her, seeing if she was alright and all that stuff, while I had my hand covering my mouth. It wasn't the fact that this little bitch got hurt, it was the fact that she got hit with instant karma and had me almost dying laughing. She played a stupid game and she won a stupid prize. And it looks like she learned her lesson, as she never spoke to me again after this incident. So at least Mother Nature was able to step up for me, if only she could have done the same for the football and syrup. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the third health session. So this health session was on reproductive health, so basically sex ed. But just like a reproductive health unit way back in from 7th grade, we didn't go into crazy detail, but we did touch on abstinence, wearing protection, STDs, HIV, and really the same stuff we did in 7th grade. So much of this was stuff that I already knew, but also a review of our reproductive health unit from 7th grade. Additionally, if you saw part 3, then you might recall me writing my notes in my school issue tracker that I had to carry with me everywhere I went. Well, we had to do this again. So for the second year in a row, I had notes about STDs and condoms in my tracker. I was at least able to use it on the test and got pretty much a free 100, but as a result, I had to carry a tracker that had notes about this stuff for the rest of the school year. Thank God I never lost this thing, because if I did, I don't even want to describe how embarrassed I would be. But I do have another pretty funny story regarding trackers when we get to the last day of school, so be prepared for that. Anyways, I remember the reproductive health unit from 8th grade a lot because better than the one from 7th grade, because the week after we wrapped it up, our PE teachers did a demonstration for us to show how easily STDs spread. So 6 boys and 6 girls were taken as volunteers. Each volunteer was given a cup. What happened was that each volunteer took turns sharing their cup with someone from the other gender. After time was up, one of the PE teachers put food coloring into each volunteer's cup. If the cup turned a color, that implied an STD. If not, it implied no STDs. Ultimately, only one volunteer had no STD. Now, the reason I remember this demonstration was because it was quite possibly the worst way they could have demonstrated this. When a volunteer shared their cup with someone else, that of course implied sex. Now, this would be fine in high school since that's when sex is considered cool, which is probably why I'm a loser because I'm in college and I've never had sex. But in middle school, sex is a really funny topic. Therefore, while I just sat there with my typical resting face, since I was a little more mature, others were dying laughing at the fact that, oh my god, they had sex! Our teachers tried to calm us down and tell them to grow up, but it was no use. As a result, a couple people ended up getting sent to the office while the PE teachers went off about how we need to act mature and stuff. However, I can't say that the students laughing were not completely in the wrong, as having student volunteers participate in this was a weird ass way to get this through. But considering my PE teachers were a bunch of pedophiles, I guess that kind of explains it. But if I were one of the teachers, I would have just done this demonstration myself to make it much less weird, as well as for it to not be nearly as quote-unquote funny for the immature students. Last thing I want to discuss for February, let's talk about my YouTube channel. So even though this is a horrible month for me mentally, this was one of the best months for my YouTube channel, excluding June 2016, which was when I started my channel, and May 2020 when I uploaded that one Super Mario Maker video that hit over 100,000 views. So, near the beginning of this month, I started the Miitopia series. Miitopia for the 3DS was very new at the time. As a result, I was getting around 250 views per video in the series, and considering I uploaded I think a total of 52 parts in the series, yeah, I got an absolutely truckload of views and new subscribers. As a result, around the middle of the month, I hit 100 subscribers. I was really happy to see my progress, and I still enjoy looking back at the progress now at over 400 subscribers. It's always nice hitting a milestone, as well as seeing just how far my channel has come since then. But yeah, that happened this month. Anyways, let's move on to March. Oh boy, this is going to be a very difficult month to talk about. Well, honestly, only the first half of it. March 2018 was a weird month, because while I consider it the worst month of my life, it was only the first half that was the worst month ever. The second half of the month was actually really good, which I'll explain when we get there. Anyways, before I talk about what made this month so rough, I'd like to first talk about my 9th swim meet. So, I swam this meet on Saturday, March 3rd. This meet was actually the same meet as my first ever meet, with it being at the same pool and the same name, just being 2018 and not 2017. So if you've seen part 3, this pretty much worked the same way that my first meet did. So the events that I swam at this meet were the 200 IM, 100 freestyle, 100 breaststroke, and 100 butterfly. Of course my coach decided to place me in my least favorite event again. God, this guy really loved watching me suffer. So let's discuss these meets. On the 200 IM, I got a time of 3 minutes and 12 seconds, which was a new best by a second. On the 100 freestyle, I got a minute and 18 seconds. On the 100 breaststroke, I got a minute and 40 seconds. And finally, on the 100 butterfly, you guessed it, I got DQ'd for not pointing my toes. Yeah, it happened again. My coach was of course pissed as hell, which at this point, I'm not sure how he didn't catch up on the fact that I was not ready to swim a 100 butterfly. Although to be fair, the next time I swim this event, I would actually do it properly, and I'll discuss when we get there at the end of March. So now, let's discuss the reason why this was the worst month of my life, as well as the worst day of my life. What I am about to tell y'all is an incredibly dark and downright disturbing story that greatly defines who I am today. This was the exact moment I became an adult. However, this event would also go on to cause me a lifetime's worth of trauma and PTSD. Even though this happened 5.5 years ago, I'm still completely traumatized from what happened these 2 days, and these 2 days continue to haunt me, even if I am no longer depressed. I also am going to go ahead and give another disclaimer, since we're at the most vulgar part of this entire story time. I am about to discuss my attempted suicide. If you read The Charm, this event is what inspired Chapter 75, which I often refer to as the darkest chapter, so I ask that you, my viewers, please be very respectful and pay attention to my words, as the story I am about to tell y'all might just save someone's life one day. Also, I will be mentioning some details that I've never told on Storytime before, as in past story times, I've always purposely left out details when discussing this brutal day. But for this story time, I will not leave any details out, as now that I have written The Charm, I feel more comfortable sharing what used to be some secret details about this event. Anyways, before I talk about the worst day of my life, I should provide a little bit of background information. So the first full week of March was an incredibly stressful and anxiety-filled week, even before this happened. I had far more homework this week than I had in my entire academic career, with an IMP for English, the typical algebra homework, Earth Environmental Science assignments and labs, and some 8th grade science homework, so this is already stirring me up. Additionally, I woke up to a death threat every day this week from the YouTuber. This caused my self-harm addiction to spin out of control. Rather than harming myself every night like I usually did for my homework, I began stabbing myself at every chance I had. After reading the YouTuber's morning death threats, I would usually stab myself from then until I had to go to mom's school. On the bus to school, since I sat away from most people, I harmed myself here. During lunch, I stabbed myself, and after school, I harmed myself. It got so bad that by Thursday, my hands were completely covered in lead stabs and bulls. So that brings me to Wednesday, March 7th, aka the second worst day of my life. That night, I had hit such a low point from the bullying that I endured that day, and to the death threats to just everything going on, that I decided to take my own life. So I whipped out my phone and searched up best ways to kill yourself. First thing that I saw was the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. I thought, fuck that, as I scrolled past it and came across a website that listed some ways to commit suicide. Included using a gun, hanging, burning, drowning, and other ways to die, but the one that I was most intrigued by was by stabbing with a knife. I'd stabbed myself with a pencil for a month at this point, so I felt that it would be best to stab myself with a knife. So I went to the kitchen to grab a knife. However, I noticed that my parents were in the living room, so I decided to wait until they were asleep before I went to grab a knife. So from then until I went to sleep, I stabbed myself as much as I could while also looking at ways to kill myself. But before my parents went to bed, I passed out from all the physical and mental pain I was enduring. It wasn't a serious pass out, as all that happened with me falling asleep. That brings me to Thursday, March 8th, 2018. The day that I almost died. The day that I consider to be when I hit an absolute lowest point. The day that still traumatizes me over 5 years later. The day that inspired the plot of The Charm. The day I consider to be the very worst day of my life. Let's get to it. So, this day was already unusual enough. It was parent-teacher conference day, so school let it out early. Therefore, we did not have WIN and our class times were reduced, meaning I reported to science first, then English, then algebra, then PE, then lunch, and then art. My parents did not schedule a conference, so for me, this was seemingly just an early release day. However, for me, this wasn't a special day because I was getting out early. It was a special day because I was expecting this to be my last day on this earth. It was this day that I decided I was going to end my life at the request of the YouTuber, the football, Sir, and anyone else who hated my guts. That morning, I came up with my official suicide plan after reading the death threats from the YouTuber. First, throughout the day, I was going to repeatedly stab myself with my pencil to get my skin on my hands even weaker than they already were. That morning, I also stabbed myself right at my heart so that I would have weakened my skin there. Then that night, I was going to finish myself off with a knife. Therefore, by the time I came up with my official plan, my suicide attempt had already started. And the worst part is that it continued throughout the day. I continued stabbing myself multiple times to get my skin weak. Oh, and it also did not help that the football had some choice words to shout at me as I got off the bus, since he and the other 8th graders were heading off to class. Then came 8th grade science. So, earlier, I mentioned that I had a soft spot for my science teacher, and this is exactly why, as without her, I would likely not be alive today to tell y'all the story. I will forever be indebted to her for taking the appropriate and necessary steps to not only prevent something far worse from happening, but also saving my life. This was the moment that made her, as well as my English and algebra teacher, the greatest teachers I've ever had, as those three handled this situation absolutely perfectly. So, that morning in science, we were reviewing for a test. To review, our teacher usually did Kahoot with us. Normally, I was always the first place winner, since I was the most academically gifted student in this class, as well as me just being naturally good at Kahoot. However, I did not participate whatsoever. Instead, I spent the entire time stabbing myself underneath my desk and fulfilling part 1 of my attempted suicide. Now, seeing that I was not participating whatsoever, my teacher immediately became concerned, so she came over and asked if anything was going on. I lied to her and said no. However, she quickly realized I was lying, as given by all the wounds on my hand. So she asked to see me in the hall, so we did that. That's when she picked up my left hand and almost screamed in horror. She asked me what those were. At first, I tried to play it cool. However, I decided to give in and tell her that there were stab marks. She then asked if I needed to see the counselor, to which I said no. However, I wasn't answering her question, but rather a different question. The real question that I was answering was, do you want to stay alive? On this day, I did not want to live at all. I felt that I would be better off dead and rotting in hell for the rest of eternity. I thought that anything was better than what I was going through at the time. But, fortunately, my teacher read through and knew what I meant by my answer. So she did contact the counselor in addition to other students doing the same, since most of them saw me stabbing myself. That's when I just flat out told her the truth. I told her that I was going to kill myself that night with a knife, and that I was going to make everyone happier in doing so. I mentioned that there was no hope for me and that everyone told me that I should die, so I was fulfilling their request. But as I said these things, she came over and hugged me as hard as she could while saying, "It'll be okay. You're gonna get through this. I'll do whatever I'll take to get you out of this." This went on for a little bit until class was almost over, to which we went back to her classroom, where I stabbed myself more for the remainder of the class time. In English and in algebra, I did the exact same thing. I just continually stabbed myself and gave myself more reasons to die. But then, during PE, while we were doing our warm-up, which was jogging, the counselor came over and called me over, so I went with her. First, she just asked some questions regarding my situation, saying that students and my science teacher had reported me stabbing myself. I told her exactly what I told my science teacher about my plan, while I was doing it, why I was the biggest mistake this world had ever seen, and all that other bullshit I spat at my teacher. The counselor then took me over to algebra to get my stuff, as she said that it was not okay for me to be at school. So I went over to algebra to get my stuff, where my teacher gave me some words of encouragement and told me everything would turn out fine, since my science teacher updated him and my English teacher on what was going on. I then went to my locker to pack my book bag, and then I followed my counselor to her office. She then dialed Mom on the phone, told her the situation, and then handed me the phone. I told Mom a little bit about what I was planning to do, how I was feeling, and even developed some tears in my eyes. Although I didn't cry just yet. Mom then said that she would be at my school soon. So she hung up, got her students a sub, and then drove over to my school while the counselors took me to the front office. There, Mom greeted us and came over and hugged me. However, she was not alone, as my youth pastor also came. He often came to the middle school during lunch hours to say hello to youth members eating lunch. He often did this with me back when I was eating in the cafeteria. So when Mom asked if I'd like him to join us, I said absolutely, as he was and still is a very awesome guy. So therefore, me, the counselor, Mom, and my youth pastor went to a private room to talk. I then tried to explain to Mom and my youth pastor what was going on. However, couldn't finish saying what I wanted to before I burst out into tears. I very rarely cry. Even though the last time I cried was only a few weeks ago when I read a Bible verse that really hit close to home, last time I cried before that was November 2020 when a good friend of mine passed away. And before that, it was this day. I've never been much of an emotional person, so for me to cry meant that this was a very serious and extremely extraordinary event. To which it was, as this was the worst day of my life. While I was crying though, the counselor finished what I was trying to say, so now Mom and my youth pastor were called up. However, Mom also began crying as she realized what was happening. After a little while, we went back to the front office, where the counselor gave me a hug. She also told Mom what she recommended about this. She recommended that I be taken to a mental hospital to be treated. There, I could be monitored for a little while to make sure that I wouldn't kill myself, as well as prescribe me medication to help alleviate my health. Afterwards, me, Mom, and the youth pastor walked over to Mom's van, where my youth pastor prayed with us, hugged me, and then me and Mom went home. Before she left the school, Mom first called Dad to let him know what was going on. However, Dad was in complete disbelief, as he didn't think it was really that bad. However, that's when Mom saw the stab marks on my hand, so she told Dad about those. Again, Dad was in disbelief and didn't believe her. This resulted in them getting into a super heated argument while I cried. But what really made me cry really badly was when Mom said a particular statement that still haunts me to this day. She said, "Come on, Zach just tried to kill himself. Shut the fuck up and be a dad for once." This comment absolutely set me off, as I felt that Dad didn't really care about me, which was false, as he did and would later that day realize just how fucked up things were, but at this moment, he was in the denial stage. Afterwards, Mom called my aunt to pick up Zoe from school. As while Zoe did not know what was happening to me at the time, she still did not need to be at school, so our aunt picked her up. Then once we got home, Mom laid me on the couch and began hugging me as much as she could. Both of us had cried so much at this point that we were both tired, resulting in the both of us falling asleep. Once we woke up though, we got back to dealing with the situation. Mom called Dad again and they handed me the phone. At this point, while Dad was still kind of in disbelief, he was starting to believe what was happening. However, he was still questioning why I thought this was a good idea and other stuff since he was still in the denying phase. Afterwards, Mom told me what she and Dad decided. They were going to take me to the hospital just as the counselor recommended. So we went back to our van and then headed off to the hospital. We stayed quiet for the first 20 minutes of the drive to the hospital outside of Mom's tears, as while I was no longer crying, she still was. However, that's when Mom opened her mouth and said something that still sticks with me to this day. She said, "I don't know why God is allowing this to happen, but I know that He's going to make something good come out of this situation. Whether it be in a few days, weeks, months, or years. He's going to make something good come out of this situation." Sure enough, this happened, and I'll explain how it did when we get to April. But a little while later, we arrived at the hospital. Before we got to the van, we said a little prayer and then we went in. I first had to do some drug tests as well as put on a hospital gown while Mom and Dad had to do some paperwork. Dad met us over here, and he stayed until there was time for them to leave. At this point though, Dad was no longer in the denial phase and knew exactly what was going on, as even he began to shed a few tears, which is also saying a lot because he cries even less than I do. A few hours later though, I was done with the lab tests and my gown was on and my parents were done with the paperwork. Therefore, the hospital was now ready to place me in their custody. Mom and Dad both hugged me once more, prayed with me, and then they left. For the first and only time from my birth to starting college, my parents were no longer my primary caretakers, but rather the hospital staff were. They would take care of me for 5 days and 4 nights. As for the rest of this particular night, the hospital first let me stay in this waiting room for a few hours. Here, they fed me dinner. However, I did not eat any of it. In fact, I did not eat or drink anything at all on this day, nor did I even use the bathroom. But once time was up, a doctor and 2 security guards came over and took me to where I would spend my time here. This hospital had 7 floors. 7th floor was the mental health unit, and the leftward corner of it was the children's wing, which is where I stayed. There, a nurse waited for me, which she gave me a little rundown of the place and then took me to the room I would be staying in. It was a small room with a bed in the center, as well as a few cubbies, a window, and a bathroom by the window. There's also a folder that I would fill up with documents and exercises from my time here. I then looked out the window and saw a few of the stars outside, as well as even uptown Charlotte lit up. It was a very nice view. I then prayed asking God for a miracle to happen. Sure enough, God would provide a miracle just a few days later. Afterwards, I got in bed and fell asleep really quickly. Emotions are incredibly powerful and very tiring, which is why despite taking a nap earlier this day, I was still completely worn out. Therefore, despite having the worst day ever and enduring more pain and suffering than I ever experienced in a single day, I fell asleep very easily. Ultimately, this was the second most emotional day of my life. The only day more emotional than this was December 10th, 2021, which I'll explain in part 8. And that wraps up March 8th, 2018. Oh, thank God. This is never an easy day to discuss, as it was such a god-awful day, and I still find difficult to talk about. But at least it's over, and once I finish discussing my stay at the mental hospital, I can move on to the really good parts of the story time. Okay, so first, I should explain how the wing I was in worked. Even though I haven't been here since my stay, I still remember this place very well because I find myself here very often in my dreams. So the wing had 2 hallways, a south and a west hallway. The south hallway was where the girls' rooms were, as well as a typical doctor's office room. The west side was where the boys' rooms were. So as this was where my room was, although it was also where the psychiatrist's office is, as well as where what I'll refer to as the recreational room was. The recreational room had a bunch of cards, movies, coloring books, and other fun stuff that me and the other patients spent quite a lot of time doing, which I'll discuss more when we get to Saturday. Additionally, I was also the only boy here for the first 2 days, so I had the hallway to myself. Additionally, when we did get a boy, he was placed in the girls' hallway for some reason, so I had the hallway to myself for the entire time I was here. It was quite nice actually, since it gave me a lot of peace and quiet at night and provided me with some time alone. Now, where the 2 hallways met were the entrance and exit to the wing, as well as the lobby. Lobby was where we ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as well as had some sofas, which is also where we hung out and did groups. Alright, so that's a general overview of how this wing was structured. Let's move on to my first day here. So, Friday, March 9th. I was woken up by a nurse at 7 a.m. She came in and brought me my clothes from before I was checked in. Told me that I could put them back on, and then said that breakfast was in the lobby. She also brought some fall-proof socks and told me to put them on, since they were required. So I changed back into my normal clothes, put my socks on, and then went to the lobby to eat breakfast as well as meet my fellow patients for the first time. First few minutes of breakfast were dead silent. I was with 6 girls aged 15 to 17, making me the youngest patient by far. This actually makes a lot of sense when you consider demographics and suicide. Statistically speaking, women are more likely than men to attempt suicide, while men are more likely to succeed in their attempt. Additionally, 13 years old is awfully young for someone to try to kill themselves, so it makes sense why I was much different than the others. However, despite this huge difference, we all got along pretty well. A little while later, one of the girls opened up and introduced me to her as well as the others. They then asked me questions and basically became friends with me, something I desperately needed. After breakfast came group time. A nurse gathered us around the sofas where he gave us a lesson about why suicide wasn't a good thing. He even used science to prove that it was a poor decision, which was really cool. But I didn't see the whole thing, as midway through, the weekday psychiatrist came in and called my name, so I went with her to her office. During this time I spent in her office, she basically just asked me all that happened the day before and what all led to me having the worst day that I had. I was truthful with her as I told her about the bullying, my self-harm addiction, and my plan, as well as how far I got into my attempt. However, telling her this stuff at this particular hour was really interesting, as I think at this point, I had gone almost 24 hours without harming myself. This was a big deal since I had not gone 24 hours without harming myself since before I started the habit. However, I would go much longer than just 24 hours without harming myself. In fact, I would never even harm myself again. A lot of that had to do with my mood. So even though I was still feeling really shitty on March 9th, I was still feeling much better than I was the day before. While I was still suicidal, I wasn't trying to kill myself. However, I'd get the help that I needed during my stay at the hospital. Anyways, after my discussion with the psychiatrist, I went back and joined the girls, where it was snack time, so we all enjoyed a snack. Forgot what I ate, so I can't comment on it. About an hour later though, it was time for lunch. Now, hospital food is already known for being really bad, and sure enough, the food I hate here was also terrible. The menu was the same for lunch and dinner, being chicken tenders and fries. Now, this might not seem bad. In fact, it originally wasn't, but the fact that I had to eat this every day for 2 meals a day was what made it really bad. My fellow autistic viewers might find this surprising, but unlike most autistic people, I tend to not like eating the same things over and over. Although I still absolutely hate it when my food touches other foods, which I absolutely cannot stand, especially if the foods are really juicy like beans or mac and cheese. As a result, I would lose my appetite here, which was an issue because the nurses kept track of how much we ate. Therefore, starting the next day, I would begin eating smaller portions in order for it not to raise concern. At least I would regain my appetite after eating what I consider to be the greatest meal I've ever had, which I'll get to later. After lunch, we had personal time, where we were given about 2 hours to be by ourselves in our room. We were also given hygiene equipment like soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush to shower and brush our teeth, which is when I did those things. Outside of cleaning, I mostly just stared out the window and mostly drove into self-reflection. This was my favorite part of the day, since as someone who's really introverted, I would need time to recharge after being around people for a couple hours. But once alone time was up, it was time for rec. So for rec, a Russian guy who took us to the south alley, aka the girls' hallway, and we basically just walked around the hallway and did a few stretches. These were pretty relaxing and just gave me some much needed exercise. Afterwards came music. We were taken to the recreational room, where a nurse pulled out his laptop and basically let us play a song. Just the song had to be appropriate, as well as not glorify suicide or any type of violence. I don't remember what I selected, probably a Fall Out Boy song, since I was and still am really a huge fan of them, but at least it was nice hearing some music too, as music also calms you down. This is why I like using OSTs in the background when recording story times, since they calm me down a bit, especially Pokemon. It's also why I typically listen to music when in crowded areas or when writing story time, since it calms me down and allows me to focus. After music came free time. During this time, me and the girls hung out in the recreational room playing cards, watching movies, and just having fun while also going over to the lobby for a snack, as we were allowed to get snacks in the lobby's refrigerator. Little while later came dinner. Dinner was the same deal as lunch. Food was horrible. But after it came visitations. Only parents were allowed to come for visitations, so only my parents could, not my sister, teachers, or anyone else who probably wanted to see me. My parents visited me every night I was here. Now, every visitation, with the exception of Monday night's visitation, was usually a very serious time, as my parents usually spent this time questioning me and trying to get answers. I'll explain why Monday was different when we get there. Anyways, my parents also acted as messengers for my teachers, counselor, youth pastor, and discipleship pastor, all of whom showed grave concern for me. Meanwhile, my teachers acted as messengers to my peers back at school. According to my parents, they were all really concerned about me on Thursday as well as that day. They were constantly asking our teachers where I was and if I was okay, since I also made a multitude of suicide threats on March 7th and 8th and of course stabbed myself in class. Additionally, they also had a meeting with my teachers, counselor, and principal, where they basically discussed all that happened before, and my parents also told them where I was and all that. Now, even though they nor I knew how long I would be in the hospital, they also talked about plans regarding my life after my discharge. One of the key things they discussed was my schedule. Now, schedule changes were almost never allowed, since that meant the school had to go through a pretty long process regarding student files and stuff. However, since my case was very special and it was deemed necessary to have my classes switched, my classes were switched so that now I had English for first block and science for second block. This also meant that I would now eat lunch with those in science for second block. This is perfect because many of those students concerned about me in this class, since I also went to church with a lot of them. I'll talk more about my new schedule and my new classmates later. But for now, my parents basically explained that this is how my schedule would be when I was discharged, which I was really happy with. After that, they then moved and talked about what was happening with me online. So earlier that day, they went through my phone and saw all the death threats that I was being sent, as well as all the drama I was involved in on Google+. So they asked me about what all was happening here, so I explained them what was going on. However, I didn't mention the death threats until Mom brought them up, to which she said that if she saw the man who sent me death threats to me, she'd smack the fuck out of him. I wholeheartedly agree with and would do the same. Thankfully, that man who sent me those threats would get a taste of karma roughly 3 years later. However, what I remember most about this particular visitation was that in the middle of it, a nurse came over and talked to us. She basically said that I did not belong at the hospital at all, and I was much smarter than most other patients. As much as I deny myself being smart, the truth of the matter is that I am really smart, and the evidence is really obvious. I'm only 19 years old and I'm about to start my last full year of college, where I'm majoring in one of the toughest majors, accounting, and minoring in one of the toughest minors, economics. In fact, I also attained senior status in college, aka 90 or more credit hours, before I turned 18. I also graduated with my high school diploma, associate's degree, and a business administration certificate in just 3.5 years rather than 4, at only 17 years old, all while maintaining a 4.7 GPA. And just to put the icing on the cake, I have an IQ of 143, putting me in the top 0.2% of people in terms of intelligence. Although I do have a lot of issues using IQ as a measure of intelligence, as it doesn't test all levels of someone's intelligence, but rather just one. But really, I shouldn't be making excuses for myself, although I do really want to live a normal life just like most others. But all this comes to play because being as smart as I am, I shouldn't have let the low-life piece of shit on YouTube dictate my thoughts and well-being, nor should I have let those low-life bullies at school get to me either. I'm way smarter than them, which is what this nurse was trying to get at. The last thing that my parents discussed with me before visitations was over was regarding a friend of mine who had a freakout that day. So I was good friends with this kid named Robbie. Robbie often joined me in Pokemon Showdown streams back when I used to stream, and also is a member of the boys group, alongside me and Ryan. After learning about what happened to me and all that went down, Robbie became worried sick and developed a lot of stress. This resulted in that Friday, him pretty much freaking the hell out when someone said something to him, so much so that he picked up a chair and attempted to throw it at him. The guy he tried to throw a chair at took hold of the chair before he could throw it and sit it down, and Robbie was suspended for a couple days. So this only reinforced the idea that, yeah, people cared about me. Even after throwing my raft quite a few times, people still cared and were very concerned about me. Afterwards, it was time to leave. Before they left, Mom and Dad handed me some stuff from home. They gave me an extra pair of clothes, a Bible, and some missing schoolwork that they said that I could do if I felt like. Which I did get some schoolwork done, most of which I did at night before going to bed. Then about an hour after just hanging out in my room, I went to sleep. Now, while the beds were surprisingly comfy despite the thin blankets, which were thin so that we wouldn't be able to hang ourselves, I did not sleep very well at all throughout my stay. Every night at my stay, I had a nightmare related to either March 8th, my suicidal thoughts, or the bullies or whatever stressed me out in general. These nightmares were not exclusive to the hospital, as I would have numerous more in the future. Anyways, the next day, being Saturday, March 10th, was a good day. This was actually the day that I was supposed to compete in the Science Olympiad tournament, since I signed up for it. Mom let my coach know what the deal was, so of course she took me out of the competition, as well as generous enough to not count my missing environmental science work as late. I'll talk more about makeup work later. Now, what made this day good was that this was officially the day that I stopped being suicidal. After making it 48 hours without harming myself, I kind of realized just how much harm I did to myself throughout February and March and decided that no, I didn't need to die. And plus, I had so much to live for. So this is the day that I stopped being suicidal. However, I was still depressed, but luckily, that would change pretty soon. Anyways, this was also an interesting day because we had quite a bit of change in schedule. So on weekends, they let us sleep in a little later. So instead of getting up at 7, I got up at 8. On top of that, we also didn't do as much. So instead of doing rec and music and other stuff, all we did on this day was Sunday was play in the recreational room, eat and morning groups, on top of talking to the psychiatrist and visitations. And of course, being the weekend, we also had the weekend staff take care of us, so different nurses, techs, and a different psychiatrist. So I got to meet the weekend psychiatrist that day. She had notes from the weekday psychiatrist, although she still had a few questions, so I answered them for her. However, during our time together, she also decided to go ahead and prescribe me an antidepressant called Zoloft. This is a drug that slows the nervous system down, making it harder to have the negative thoughts I was having. I would take this drug every night, as another side effect of it made me drowsy, so it made sleeping a little easier too. I was on this medication for 2.5 years before I eventually got off of it, which I'll talk about in part 7. However, initially, getting on Zoloft was rather difficult. That night, I took my first dose of Zoloft. However, the next morning, I felt absolutely awful, like I was sick to my stomach and just felt horrible. Got so bad I even vomited. Therefore, I ended up staying in my room that morning per the nurse's recommendations. As for the talk with my psychiatrist, that still happened, just that she came over to my room and we talked. We mostly talked about the side effects, where she then prescribed me another medicine to help me deal with these side effects called Benadryl. So I took the Benadryl that night about 30 minutes after taking the Zoloft, and the next day, I wasn't feeling as bad. But before I get there, I should mention that I did start to feel better Sunday afternoon, as I was able to continue doing normal stuff. And funnily enough, this was the only day I took the Benadryl, as it took only 2 days for Zoloft to really enter my body, so I stopped taking the Benadryl the following day. Then came Monday, March 12th. This is a very special day because it officially marked the end of the worst time period of my life. Starting the next day, I would begin a new chapter of my life that I still often consider to be the best chapter of my life ever. The reason this happened was because of that night during visitations. So Mom and Dad were a little late since they got stuck in traffic, but they still came, so that's really all that mattered. Anyways, instead of being all serious like they were during visitations the previous few nights, they decided to be a little more silly and just joked around with me. They could already tell that I was feeling better as the days went on, so they felt that this was now the perfect day to relax a little and have a little fun. We joked around, roasted each other, and just really acted like fools and friends. I had not been in this position of joking around and having fun with anyone in quite a long time before this. Ever since I became depressed, all I wanted was for someone to care about me and tell me things were alright, as well as just simply be my friend and include me. And at this moment, I felt just that. For the first time since winter retreat 2 months earlier, I genuinely felt happy and comforted. I also felt a sense of relief, as it felt like a huge burden on my shoulders had just been lifted off. It was at this moment that I knew that I was no longer bound by the chains of depression. I was free. I was cured of depression. We then talked a little more and joked around a little bit, although they did get a little serious when they talked about how things were going back at home and what was going on at school. But they weren't too serious to kill the mood. They just mentioned that everyone was missing me and was ready for me to come back. But once visitations were over, they then left, and I now had the rest of the night. Now, I should also mention that me and the other patients were all really well liked by the nurses and other hospital staff. In fact, one of the nurses even said that we were the best group of patients she ever had. So as a reward that night, they let us into what they called the VIP recreational room, which had video games, books, and a bunch of other exclusive stuff they kept for the more well-behaved patients. However, even though I was a big gamer at the time, I wasn't really in the mood to play video games or really do anything. After visitations and literally being cured of depression, I really needed some time to myself to reflect on what all happened. So I asked if I could go to bed early, which the nurses let me. So I first took my medicine and then went to my room. I didn't just stare out the window for a good hour, where I mostly just thought things over and considered what all just happened. I also began envisioning what my life would be like when I was discharged. At the time, I still didn't know when I was leaving, but I would the next day. But once I was done thinking, I then went to bed and got some sleep to prepare me for the first of many incredible days to come. And that brings me to March 13th, 2018. I consider this day to be amongst the best days of my life. Now, when it comes to the worst days ever, the answer to that one is super obvious, being March 8th, 2018. However, I don't exactly have a set of best days ever because I don't have a set best day ever because I've had a lot of great days over my 19-year life. But a couple of days I consider to be the best days of my life include June 7th, 2016, June 23rd, 2018, March 23rd, 2019, and December 10th, 2021. I discussed June 7th in Part 2, and I'll discuss June 23rd and March 23rd in Part 5, and I'll discuss December 10th in Part 8. Anyways, on top of being one of the best days ever, this is also a great day because it marked the beginning of one of the best time periods of my life, being post-depression period Part 1. This was a time period that I pretty much hit my all-time high in terms of happiness, and kind of felt like a reward for getting through depression. This time period went from March 13th, 2018, all the way to November 17th of that year. I'll explain how it ended in Part 5, although I'll also talk about how it at least led to Post-Depression Period Part 2, which lasted from March 23rd, 2019 to March 15th, 2020. So, that morning, I was woken up as usual and ate breakfast. Things were normal until the psychiatrist called me, so I went over to her office. So, the day before visitations, my psychiatrist examined my behavior with my parents. She noticed that I seemed a lot happier and very excited. We went and talked for a little bit, and she also did an assessment, where she officially determined that I was no longer depressed, which I kind of expected since I knew I wasn't the day before after visitations. Therefore, she decided it was time for me to be discharged, so she called Mom, who told her that she would be up there in 30 minutes to pick me up. So, after talking with the psychiatrist, I went back to my room to get ready to start my new life. A little while later, I got my stuff packed up, and Mom was waiting for me. We then went over to this meeting room where a social worker talked to us a little bit. Afterwards, we were dismissed, and I then walked outside the wing for the first time since Thursday. Then, a few minutes later, we went outside where I got to breathe a huge breath of fresh air for the first time since Thursday. So, first thing that me and Mom did after we left the hospital was eat. So, as mentioned, I lost my appetite at the hospital. I had no vegetables, only chicken tenders and fries. So, Mom took me over to Cracker Barrel, where I got to eat by far the best meal I've ever had. I ate steamed broccoli, pinto beans, lima beans, and green beans. Every single bite of this meal tasted so good and refreshing that I felt like I was walking in heaven. It felt nice to be eating something different, and at this moment, I officially regained my appetite. After eating such an amazing meal, me and Mom then went over to Zoe's school. Zoe did not know I had just been discharged, so when she was notified that she was being dismissed early, she was really confused. But when she saw me standing in the front office, she came running as fast as she could. She slammed through the door and then jumped almost on top of me and wrapped her arms around me, where I of course did the same to her. We ended up hugging for an entire minute. The night of March 8th, Mom and Dad told her what happened to me and where I was. Every night while I was in the hospital, she cried herself to sleep, since she was so worried about me and just the fear of almost losing her big brother. Afterwards, the three of us went back home. When we arrived, I went straight to my room where I saw a few things on my bed. One was from Zoe, saying that she was worried about me and ready for me to come home. Another was a batch of cookies and a letter from my grandmother, talking about how worried she was and missing me. I also had a lot of other stuff from other family members, which I was very greatly appreciated. After giving me about an hour to be by myself, me, Mom, and Zoe regrouped and played Uno until Dad got home. Dad knew I had been discharged, so when he arrived home, he ran over and hugged me. We then had dinner, and then after dinner, me, Mom, and Dad hung out in my room. We watched The Big Bang Theory until I fell asleep at only 9 o'clock. This might not sound like much, however, when you consider the fact that I am and I've always been a big night owl, with Part 3 being proof of that since I literally recorded it from 2 to 4 a.m., you can kind of see why this is a big deal. Emotions can be really exhausting. In fact, all of my most emotional days typically involve me falling asleep pretty easily. I fell asleep very easily on March 8th, which was the second most emotional day of my life. And when we get to Part 8, I'll discuss an even more emotional day that I also fell asleep very easily. March 13th, 2018 was, while not exactly on the level of those days, it was still a very emotional day, since of course it was the beginning of the new me. My suicide attempt transformed me into a different person, one that would be completely unrecognizable to 11 or 12-year-old me. Ultimately though, it would be what transformed me from a child to an adult. Even now as a legal adult, I still point to this event as the moment that turned me into an adult. So it made sense why I was pretty emotional on this day that I got out of the hospital, as I would end up having a vastly different life than I had before. Now, the word transformation is a synonym for change. While of course you had the main change with me growing up, there were a lot of other important changes that started too as a result of this situation. In fact, there are 9 changes I want to discuss. The first and biggest one, short-term wise, was my change in schedule. As mentioned earlier, my schedule was changed so that now I would begin going to English for first block and science second block, with my other classes remaining the same. Much of this was because the second block science class was the class that was by far most worried about me, since not only did I have a lot of friends in that class, but I also went to church with a lot of them. As a result, I would also begin eating with this class during lunch and no longer need to eat lunch in the cubicle. The second one involves my phone. So after looking through my phone and seeing all the shit that was happening with me on Google Plus and YouTube, my parents decided to take my phone away indefinitely, which I was fine with, as I 100% needed some time away from my phone as well as the internet in general. I would receive my phone back in April, and I'll explain how I got it back when we get there. The third one kind of correlates to this, that being the fact that I no longer use Google Plus and took a 4-month break from YouTube. Now, over the 7 years that I've done YouTube, I've taken multiple breaks. However, this was the only voluntary break I've ever taken, as all the other breaks from YouTube have been because of my own decision. I would return to YouTube in July, although I would upload completely different content and with some restrictions that I'll discuss in part 5. The fourth one involves my science teacher. So obviously, she and my other teachers were super concerned about me because of course they almost lost a student. So beginning the day that I returned, as well as every day at the beginning of class, she would come over and basically just ask me how I was doing and check up on me. So now, every day, I had someone who was checking up on me and making sure I was still doing well. Additionally, my English and algebra teacher also checked up on me often and made sure I wasn't doing I was doing alright. In fact, the day I returned, my algebra teacher changed the seating chart so that I was now sitting directly in front of his desk, while the bullies were sitting at the opposite end of the classroom, since I was still in the same algebra class. However, I was also sitting near my friends, so even if my algebra teacher was not in the room, I still had a couple people who to look out for me in the case the bullies decided to do something, which they thankfully didn't. The fifth change kind of correlates to the previous one, and that's coursework. After I was discharged, not only did the material in all my classes seem easier, but the workload also became lighter. My algebra teacher started assigning less homework, and so did my English and science teachers. My Earth Environmental Science teacher also assigned less coursework, meaning now I was no longer as stressed out and kept my anxiety to a minimum. My parents also chimed in by not only being less tough on my grades, but also no longer forcing me to create weekly schedules every week, so I no longer had to worry about those. The sixth change dealt with transportation from school. So one night at the hospital during visitations, I told mom and dad about being bullied on the bus and how I was often shamed and embarrassed in front of everyone. So from then until the end of the school year, mom began picking me up from school. She would leave work a few minutes early every day to come pick me up, where she would then take me to her school and then we would wait on Zoe. She actually worked this out with her principal, who agreed to take control of her class while she was getting me. So from then until the end of the school year, mom picked me up directly from school. I'd still continue riding the bus to school since it was just me and the other teachers' kids, all of whom were really nice. Now, changes in 7 and 9 are going to be, or 7 and 8, are going to be a lot more different from other ones, as they were long-term changes that were either affecting me for a couple years or still affect me today. Change 7 involved my medication. So from my stay in the mental hospital all the way until I was 16 years old, I took Zoloft every night. I didn't have to take any Benadryl after Sunday night since by then my body got used to the medicine, but I continued to take Zoloft every night to slow down my nervous system as well as make it easier to fall asleep. Change 8 was therapy sessions. So beginning on Thursday, March 15th, I began seeing a therapist every 2 weeks. These basically provided me time to talk to a professional about my issues, as well as work on healthy habits. These also allowed me to talk to someone about issues I didn't feel comfortable bringing up with my parents, as well as someone to vent to. These were always really helpful, and are so helpful that I still do them today, so this is a change that never stopped once it was implemented. Then for change 9, this is an interesting one because it actually involved high school. I will discuss it more in depth when we get to May, and also explain it thoroughly at the beginning of part 5. So yeah, a lot of stuff changed and as a result of this situation. However, that isn't to say that everything was better, as there was one aspect that did harm me, and that was sleep. So, as I mentioned earlier, I had a nightmare every night I was in the hospital. These nightmares consisted of either my bullies, the death threats, violence, or March 8th in general. However, these nightmares were not exclusive to the mental hospital, as even after depression, or after discharge, I still had these nightmares very often. Throughout both post-depression periods, they were very common. However, as time went on, they became much less common and the chain of events causing them ended in March of 2022. Although I still occasionally got one from time to time, but not very often. And with that, let's talk about my first day back at school, which was Wednesday, March 14th. So after a really good night's sleep, I got my stuff packed up and that morning worked normally. Then I went to school. I went to Wynn. So that weekend that I was in the hospital was when the Science Olympiad team did the competition. Mom had already told my coach where I was that Friday, so it wasn't a surprise that I was of course not participating. and with the competition being over, that meant that Science Olympiad did not have much going for it. Therefore, I chose to go to my algebra teacher's classroom during WIN for the remainder of the year. This was supposed to get extra practice on the homework, but considering that a couple of my friends were in this WIN and none of the bullies were, it's safe to say that I goofed off, especially since I always did my homework the night before. After WIN came my new first block, being English. My teacher started class by introducing me to which the class was very eagerly accepted me, and pretty soon I was already really popular. Half of this class had science for second block, so it makes sense why everyone was happy to have me. Now, while I was in the hospital, the class was introduced to a project where they had to write a literary essay on the outsiders, so pretty much what we did with the giver. For it, they had to answer the question, was Dally a hero or a bad guy? Basically, Dally was a pretty funny and strange character. While sometimes he was good, other times he was bad. So for this essay, we had to argue whether or not he was a good or bad. Well, the class did. I, however, was exempt from this project since not only was I not there when our teacher introduced this project, but I was also already behind on some coursework. So while everyone else was doing this project, I was doing makeup work. And by makeup work, I was doing my INP. So we returned to doing these for quarter 3. Therefore, I decided to do mine on the new Diary of Wimpy Kid book since I read that December, even if that was quarter 2. I forgot what book it was since I don't remember the newer ones as well as the older ones. Books 1 through 8 are probably the greatest books ever written. But I read it and of course did my INP on it. And like the INP from October, this one was not very memorable, but I do remember getting 100 on it. Ultimately, this is the last INP I think I did. I don't remember doing one for quarter 4, so this is the last INP I did for English. I finished it that Friday, so it wasn't like I did it in just that period. After English came my new second block, being Science. So now this was that one weird-ass class that had PE, and lunch occurred during the middle of it. And this was also when we finished the second half of those classes. Now, as I was entering the class, my teacher was waiting outside. When she saw me, she ran over and gave me a hug, and then asked to talk to me for a little bit. She basically just asked how I was doing, said she was relieved that I was okay, and then told me a little bit about this class. So according to her, this was a crazy-ass class because it was a massive sausage fest. 30 students total, and among them, 25 boys and 5 girls. But considering I already dealt with the football and SIR, this was like nothing. So I told her that I was still cool with it and new class arrangements. She also told me that she would like for me to sit with the team at lunch, which I told her I planned to do anyways, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. And I've got to say, this class was fucking awesome. I was immediately welcomed by the whole class, everyone was checking up on me, and overall, it was fun. I was also there with a lot of people that I went to church with, so now I actually shared a class with them and got along with everyone. Pretty much immediately, science became my new favorite class since I was now popular in it. Oh, and I also had a lot of popular students who were in this class, and they even liked me and welcomed me, so it's safe to say that I was becoming popular myself. Speaking of which, when the bullies saw dips in their popularity after I returned, while they were still maintaining their popular status as well as continue being friends with the others, they gained a lot more haters and saw a lot of negative perceptions regarding them, which they 100% deserved, as you have to be really low to make an autistic kid almost take his life. Although to be fair, nobody except my teachers knew that I was autistic, since it wasn't until last December when I revealed it. But still, that's a shitty move, so people stopped liking them as much. However, as I said, they still maintain friendships, including friendships with many of my peers at church. Even though this seems insignificant, I'll discuss a theory I proposed in Storytime 29 involving this fact that led to what happened at Fuge. But for this Storytime though, my church peers were all really cool, and I got along with them really well. After that came PE. So there was a big issue when I returned to PE. So that Friday, while I was not at school, students signed up for electives. Therefore, I was placed in the basketball elective, which is also why this is one of the few PE electives I remember. I was scared about this because not only were the bullies in it, but there weren't really many people in it either, so I was scared that I would have to deal with them. Thankfully though, a friend of mine was in this elective too, so I was not alone. Additionally, my counselor came right before we played our first game. She then took me over to her office where she asked how I was doing and all that. We then talked about my stay and how I was feeling better and all that stuff. And then she told me that since I did have some makeup work to do, she then asked me to sacrifice my PE time to work on it, which I more than happily accepted. So after our discussion, I went to my science teacher's room to get caught up on makeup work. I actually had to make up an exam, so I took the test during PE and somehow got 100 on it. I also, of course, had other makeup work for science, algebra, that IMP for English, and some Earth environmental science work. I wasn't given any due dates to complete that work since my teachers didn't want to stress me out after everything that happened, so I was able to take my time on these. As a result, it would not be until the following Thursday, March 22nd, when I was completely caught up, so I got out of PE until Monday, March 26th. Friday the 23rd was the teacher workday, so no school on that day. Then once it was time, I went to lunch with my teachers. They all collectively checked up on me and talked with me. And then came lunch. So this would be the first time since February that I did not eat in the cubicle. Instead, because I now had science for second block, I now had people trying to convince me to sit with them and join them, which felt absolutely mesmerizing after of course sitting at a table by myself the month prior. Ultimately, I chose to sit at a table with some of my friends, and as a result, lunch became so much better and I was feeling much happier, especially since I wasn't being bullied or sitting alone and because I was now being included. Now, a really cool thing about my table was that when it came time to wiping the table, what we did is that we took turns cleaning our eighth of the table. This quote-unquote table leader, whose name was Sebrin, would get the sprayer and cloth and spray down the table. He would then clean his side, and then we would all take turns cleaning our individual side. I thought this was so cool since it kind of illustrated the point that we were all equal and we were all friends, unlike the bullies who forced me to clean the table every day. Then I went back to science and wrapped up class. By the way, our teacher treated this class like my English teacher did for second block, where she reserved the first half for instruction and the second half for coursework, so this format didn't change as the class changed. Afterwards came algebra. This was the same class as before I went to the hospital, just that our teacher made a new seating chart and placed me really far away from the bullies. So that's really all that happened here, as well as some checking up on me like what the other teachers did. Then came art, which also didn't have much going on other than my art teacher checking up on me as well as waiving all my makeup work, so I didn't have any makeup work for art. And after that, we were dismissed. I didn't attend tutoring on this day, so I went straight to the car rider line where mom picked me up. And yeah, that was my first day back at school. It was a really successful day. Everyone was happy for me to be back, and afterwards, I knew I was going to like school for the rest of the school year. And it damn sure would, as my fourth quarter of 8th grade would be one of the greatest academic quarters ever, thanks to the support of my friends, teachers, parents, and other peers. In fact, the rest of 2018 would be so good that I consider this year, alongside 2021, as the second best year of my life, with 2019 taking the spot as the best year. Now, while things were going great for me, things were not going so well for my algebra teacher. Shortly after I was discharged, he suffered a heart attack. Thankfully, he was alright and was able to make it through. However, his doctor only allowed him to work half days. So therefore, starting roughly a week after I returned, he began only appearing for class twice to 3 times a week, as he would rotate between our class and his morning classes. Therefore, when he was not there, a math teacher from a different team taught us the material. She was good, but not as good as our math teacher, but despite this, still managed to be really successful for the remainder of the class, since not only were we getting to the end of the year, but I was also no longer depressed and therefore was able to take on this class with a clear mind. So other than that, not really much happened other than me getting a lot of attention and support. So let's move on from academics and talk about swimming. On March 25th, I swam my 10th swim meet, as well as the last meet I'll discuss in the story time. So for a little bit of background information, this meet was at Mecklenburg Aquatics in Uptown Charlotte, which is also where my second swim meet was, which I talked about in part 3. This place, as I said in part 3, was massive. Of course, this is where many Olympians are trained, including Michael Phelps himself, so you bet that this pool is pretty fancy. And it sure is, with the pool being extendable as well as full-on front desk and gym in this building. Yeah, it's a really fancy place. Also, as you could guess, this is a pretty big meet with 13 teams swimming at this meet, so events were really long and had like 10 heats per meet. Now, this meet was also significant because if my coach hadn't demonstrated that he was an asshole, this was the meet that really started to show it. Earlier, I said that this meet took place on March 25th. That might seem strange when you consider the fact that this was a Sunday. Even though this was a 3-day meet, I usually only swim meets on Saturdays. That's the mindset that me and my parents had, so we got up and went to Charlotte on Saturday morning, being the 24th. When we got there, I of course got ready like I usually did. However, that's when Mom looked at the heat sheet and noticed I wasn't in any events. So I took a look at the sheet myself, and sure enough, I was not in any events. I then flipped over to Sunday events, and sure enough, I was on the roster for Sunday. We both became really confused because Mom signed me up for Saturday only, so why was I signed up for Sunday roster? So we went to my coach and asked him why he put us there. He said that I was put in any day, so he placed me on Sunday. While he was right that Mom made a mistake, he still should have known that I was better swimming Saturday because I always swam Saturdays. He and Mom exchanged words until Mom got fed up and we left the pool. Now, the reason my coach signed me up for Sunday was actually because of religious reasons. So, me and my family went to church every Sunday, and our coach knew that. He, however, was a hardcore atheist who despised religion and anything and anyone religious. He even tried to make us feel guilty for missing practices over church reasons. So seeing that Mom mistakenly signed me up for any day, he took advantage of this and signed me up for Sunday only so that we could have missed church. Yeah, he really couldn't be any more of a dick than that. On top of making us drive all the way to Charlotte for no reason. Yeah, fuck this dude, he's an asshole, and his bullshit is the reason why many of the members of the team quit, including myself and Zoe, and I'll talk about that in part 5. I did ultimately swim on Sunday, so that's why this meet was on March 25th, for me rather than March 24th. Oh, and if he already wasn't fucking with me enough, my coach also decided to be a dick with this meet through the events he signed me up for. He signed me up for the 200 freestyle, 100 breaststroke, and the 100 butterfly, meaning I had to swim yet another 100 butterfly and probably get DQ'd on it again. But even worse than that, the 50 freestyle was offered at this meet. For the past few months, I continually asked him if he could put me in the 50 freestyle, to which he said no because it wasn't offered. So knowing that it would be offered at this meet, I asked him if he could put me in it, to which he said that he would. But instead, he put everyone except me in this event. I was the only one on the team not swimming this event. What an asshole. But of course he didn't hesitate to put me in the 100 butterfly since he knew how much I hated it and didn't care for it. He really is a god-awful coach. Anyways, let's talk about my events. So on the 200 freestyle, I got a time of 2 minutes and 55 seconds, which was a 10-second improvement over my previous legit record. Not that crazy incorrectly timed record for my 4th meet. And on the 100 breaststroke, I got a minute and 37 seconds. Then for the 100 butterfly, if you guessed that I got DQ'd on this event, well, you would actually be wrong, as by some miracle, I managed to swim this event properly and did not get DQ'd. For the first time ever, I swam a genuine 100 butterfly, getting a time of 1 minute and 40 seconds. Finally, after 4 DQs, I finally swam a legitimate 100 butterfly. Now my coach could stop yapping about me getting DQ'd. However, I would learn that November that my coach wasn't exactly done with me swimming the 100 butterfly. But for now, I was done with the 100 butterfly since I finally had time on my record. Oh, and guess what my coach said when I talked to him about my 100 butterfly? He asked, "Ready for the 50 freestyle?" after knowingly not putting me in it. Yeah, this guy really couldn't be more of a dipshit than this. But at least I was done with swimming meets for 8 months, as well as out of the water for 3. As that Wednesday, March 28th, I did something that was both really stupid and actually kind of genius at the same time. So to celebrate the end of the short course season, our team had a cookout, which we never did since our coach was of course very set on swimming and winning meets. Anyways, something to note about the 24-yard pool that we swam at, which is where the cookout took place, was that near the pool building was the tennis court. Me, Alex, and a couple of our other friends decided to go over to the tennis court and hung out there, so we did that. However, that's when I had one of the greatest ideas ever conceived by humanity. What if instead of going around the tennis net, why not jump over the tennis net? So I did that. I got down, counted to 3, and then ran as fast as I could towards the net and then jumped as high as I could. However, I just barely made it over the net, as one of my shoes got caught up in the net. This flung me directly towards the concrete ground. In order to prevent my head from hitting the ground, I extended my elbows out so when I hit the ground, I landed on them instead of my head. My left arm hit the ground hard while on my right arm hit not nearly as hard. As a result, both of my arms were in pain, more particularly my left arm, but my right arm was also hurting. At first, I thought it was simple scratch, as the pain wasn't all that bad. As I started to realize what had happened was much more severe than a simple scratch when I noticed that I couldn't move my arms too much. My friends then helped me up and took me over to the rest of the crowd. One of my friends' mom is a nurse, so she took a look at my arms and determined that the both of them might be broken. She then handed me her phone so I could call Dad. I didn't call Dad letting him know what happened, so he came rushing over and then we went over to the emergency room. Now, my experience at this emergency room was really bad. This was a different hospital than I went to when I tried to kill myself. While there, getting checked in was pretty easy. Here, it was absolutely obnoxious. We arrived at the emergency room at 5 o'clock, but yeah, I didn't get processed in the room until 8 o'clock. Yeah, I didn't know what the doctors and nurses were doing, but it shouldn't have taken 3 hours for them to take care of me. Like, what if I had a life-threatening injury? Probably would have died. Anyways, once I eventually got checked in, my experience here only got worse. One of the nurses was so bent on putting me in a hospital gown when really, I didn't need it and it caused me tons of pain to stretch even my right arm to take my shirt off, which, mind you, was the less severe one. Thankfully, Mom, who arrived about an hour into the wait, just went in and stopped it. She told the nurse to forget about it and cut my shirt off, cut my shirt off. So that's what she did. Ultimately, they never got the gown on me, since if they did, I would be in the extreme pain when trying to get it through my left arm, so I spent the rest of the night shirtless. Eventually though, I was able to get x-rayed, which was our main purpose of coming here. They did these at 9 o'clock, so they did those and determined that I completely shattered my left arm and had minor infractions on my right arm. This meant that yes, I broke both of my arms at the same time. I was then wrapped in 2 splints, which looked really funny as fuck since you don't ever see someone in 2 splints, since even though many people have broken an arm or a leg, not many people could say they've broken both of their arms, especially at the same time. However, the material they used to wrap my splints up was super uncomfortable and really hard. At first, this might sound like a good thing, since it would protect my arms if something was to hit my arms. However, this caused blisters and bulges to form around my thumbs, as well as the lower parts of my fingers. So this material sucked. At least when I saw a pediatrician that Monday, I would get it wrapped in way better material. Afterwards, my doctor prescribed me a medicine called hydrocodone. This is a very powerful drug that treats pain. I took a dose here as well as the next day. However, because it was such a powerful drug, I mostly took an ibuprofen for the next 2 weeks. Then at 11 o'clock, I was discharged. Mom helped me into her van and then we headed home. Now, the rest of the night was difficult because of course I no longer had my arms. Therefore, my parents were really stressed out about how I was going to do typical stuff. That's when the first main issue arose. I needed to use the bathroom. At first, my parents were concerned that they thought they were going to have to go in and help me do it, which would have been very awkward. But thankfully, I learned how to use my hands to do everything I needed. Therefore, I could still use the bathroom on my own, although I had to sit down every time to use it. I also had to be careful not to get my hands too wet when washing my hands, as I didn't want to get my splints wet. Anyways, after using the bathroom, I went to sleep, where I slept for a whole 16 hours, the most I think I've ever slept at one time. After I went to sleep, Mom emailed my teachers letting them know what happened and why I wouldn't be at school the next day, so they were now up to date on what was going on. One of them actually told the other students where I was, and I'll say who it was later. Then came the next day, being Thursday, March 29th. This was actually the only day of school I missed because of my broken arms, as that Friday was Good Friday and the school was out the next week for Easter. Anyways, I woke up at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Even though Mom took off from work that day, I still wanted at least an hour after waking up to myself, so I attempted to put my slings on. I was able to get one for my left arm on, but I had no luck getting the one for the right arm, so I decided to go without it. And to my surprise, this worked really well because I realized that I could still move my right arm pretty well and do most things without it, especially since I am right-handed. So from then on, I went without the sling for my right arm. And as time went on, I realized that I could still do quite a bit. Like, I could still play video games with both arms, although I had to leave my controller to the left so that my left hand could hold it, and I could even type. Like, I was able to write a paper that day while typing at 45 words a minute, even with just one arm. Usually, I could type up to 130 words a minute, so for me, this was really slow. But compared to the average person, I was still typing faster, which is pretty cool to think about. Anyways, that went on until Mom got home. She didn't fix me something to eat, although she had to feed me herself since I couldn't reach my arms to my mouth. And then later that night, I had visitors. So my youth pastor and discipleship pastor heard about my injury, so they came that night and came over and paid me a visit. We talked for a little bit, mostly about my injury and stuff, and other than that, I don't remember too much other than, of course, them visiting. However, this did put me in good spirits for the rest of the night. Therefore, I stayed up to 2:30 that night watching YouTube videos peacefully. The next day, though, being Friday, March 30th, had a little bit more going on. I had my second therapy session, so I did that, and it was pretty hilarious at first, since my therapist didn't expect me to come in with 2 broken arms. So therefore, we mostly talked about it and how I was doing regarding it. Then, near the end of the session, Mom came over and we talked about this as a group, as well as my therapist recommended Mom giving me my phone back. Her reasoning was that I shouldn't be cooped up in my house with 2 broken arms and nobody to talk to. Even though my uncle and cousins from Delaware were coming over that night, it was still not a good idea for me to have access to the outside world. Mom would follow through with this recommendation a week after that appointment, and I'll discuss that more later. Afterwards, we went over to Walmart to buy party stuff, as my mom's side of the family always threw an Easter party every Easter, with Mom usually hosting it. Easter fell on April 1st this year, so it was a double holiday since it was also April Fool's Day. Anyways, we got to check out line, and when the cashier saw me, she looked completely horrified. I can't really blame her since it's not every day you see someone in two splints. She did ask what the hell happened to me. Now, at the time, I was really socially awkward around strangers. Even though I can still be really shy around them today, I've gotten better at being around different people as I've gotten older. But that's when Mom spoke up and said he refused to clean his room, so I broke both of his arms. The cashier, not knowing that this was a joke, almost screamed. Mom then reiterated that it was just a joke and explained the actual reason, where the cashier took a huge breath and almost laughed a bit, since jumping over the tennis net was a really stupid thing to do. Then later that night, my uncle and his two kids came over. They stayed until Monday. This worked out perfectly for me, as I now had a caretaker everywhere I went. The older child, whose name is Mason, slept in my room and hung out in my room, says he was able to take care of me for the next couple days. He'd usually be the one to go get something for me, feed me, and do anything else that I couldn't do with my arms. So I now had him for the next few days to look after me. And with that, March is officially wrapped up. Yeah, March 2018 was a massive month for me. Obviously, the biggest three things that happened this month were my suicide attempt, being cured of depression, and breaking my arms. But there were also a ton of other stuff that happened, such as the 2 swim meets I swam, becoming semi-popular at school, my new schedule, and so many other things. But the main thing was growth. I grew so much as a person in this single month that me on March 31st was nothing like me on March 1st. I just grew that much more this month, which is why I consider this to be the month, more specifically March 8th, to be when I became an adult. So with that, let's move on to April. Oh my god, I love talking about this month. April 2018 was by far the best month of the second best year of my life, and it was also if not one of the best months of my entire life. Pretty much nothing this whole month went wrong, and I was of course at an all-time high in terms of happiness, and I'd make the most important decision I've ever made and ever will make in my entire life in the middle of the month. Honestly, this month kind of felt like a reward for getting through the first quarter of the year. Like January, February, and the first half of March were awful, where I lived some of my worst days ever. But then because I got through those really bad times, I was able to have really good times, and those good times would continue all the way to November, so this was one hell of a time to be alive. To start, let's discuss Sunday, April 1st, which was Easter Sunday. So like we did every Sunday, we went to church. Our church did a special service since of course this was Easter, but afterwards, we made our way towards Sunday school. Mason followed me and went to Sunday school with me since he's a year and a half, since while he is a year and a half younger than I am, it still helped that I have my caretaker walk with me. But as we entered the student lounge, a couple of boys from science came over and started laughing. That's when one of them said, our science teacher wasn't kidding, he really did break his arms. So the teacher who spilt the beans was my science teacher. Obviously, these boys said her name, so this wasn't exactly what they said, but I do like being respectful to my teachers and peers when writing and recording story times, so I don't use their names unless they're close friends or family. But anyways, we talked for a little bit. Basically, when those two boys, as well as the rest of the class, noticed I wasn't there that Thursday, they all became really concerned. So they asked our teacher what happened, and since Mom updated her that night before, and since the entire class was worried about me, she went ahead and told the class what happened. I've since given her a hard time about this, but I'll talk more about that in part 8. Anyways, I was kind of joked around throughout Sunday school since of course I had 2 broken arms. Then after Sunday school, we had the family Easter party. Nothing too memorable happened, just family getting together and doing things. And then came the next day, being April 2nd. This was an important day because it was the day that I went and saw a pediatrician, who ultimately would be the one who would determine if I needed surgery. Now, his office was in South Park, which for anyone not familiar with Charlotte neighborhoods, it's a neighborhood about a few miles south of Uptown. It's known for being really fancy, and it's also the biggest business plaza outside of Uptown. South Charlotte in general is known for this, since it's a really fancy part of the city where all the CEOs, CFOs, and other super wealthy folks have their mansions off Lake Wylie. So the way to his office was going to be pretty fun, since we were going to get to see a lot of fancy stuff you don't really see in the suburbs where we lived, or in North Charlotte where I currently live. So that morning, we headed off to his office, where we got to meet him, and he also did some x-rays. So we cut off my splints and did x-rays on my arms. After determining the pictures, he determined that my right arm no longer needed to be in a splint, cast, or anything, so I now had complete control over my right arm. To be fair, I was expecting this because my right arm only had minor infractions. However, I didn't have good news on my left arm. Because of how severely I damaged it, as well as where I broke it, surgery was necessary to get it fixed. So we scheduled my surgery for Wednesday, April 4th, so I didn't have to wait too long before I had to do it. He then wrapped my left arm in another splint, only this time he used way more comfortable and softer material than what I had got at the emergency room, since he noticed the blisters I developed because of the splint. Additionally, he also gave me a much more comfortable sling, as sling I wore prior was really hard and uncomfortable. So now, although I wasn't too happy about having to get surgery, I felt better since I was now wearing a much more comfortable splint. After our appointment, me, Mom, and Zoe went to the South Park Mall and ate Chick-fil-A. I remember this lunch because of how free I felt after being able to move my right arm freely and my left arm being more comfortable. Like, I was able to carry the whole Chick-fil-A bag by myself and eat by myself overall. I felt amazing. Of course, if I was left-handed, this might have been an issue, but since I'm right-handed and my right hand was free, I can now do anything with one hand. The next day, I had to get an MRI as a prerequisite for surgery, so me and Mom went to a nearby hospital to get it done. Even though these don't hurt or even touch you, I was still super terrified of this, and for some reason thought a massive laser was gonna burn through my arm. But thankfully, that didn't happen, and it went pretty smoothly. And that brings us to Wednesday, March 4th, the day I had surgery. Now, the surgical center I had my surgery at was in Uptown Charlotte, not the pediatrician's office at South Park. We arrived a little early, so me and Mom just drove around Uptown until it was time. Then when it was time, we went over to the surgical center, where the pediatrician was outside waiting for us. He then helped me out of Mom's van and guided us through the center. He then got us processed, he introduced us to his surgical team, and then they got me through the pre-surgery stuff really quickly. Like in just maybe 30 minutes of arriving, I was already ready to be worked on, so it was quick. So once that began, they took me over to the operating room, and then the pediatrician told me to count backwards from 10 once he hooked me up on the anesthesia. I think I only got to 8 before I fell asleep, and then the team got to work on my arm. Now, my surgery is a difficult topic to discuss because obviously I wasn't awake when they operated on me. Therefore, I don't really know what all happened, what specific bones and muscles they worked on, or any of that. However, I do know that they went in, cut my arm, and put in metal and screwed it to my broken elbow to piece it back together. They also reattached some tendons that were cut off from the impact of the fall and placed them back together. Of course, what they actually did was a lot more complicated than what I've explained, but I'm not a medical expert. I'm just a 19-year-old college student that writes story times and talks about the dumb stuff he did as a teen. Then about 2 hours late, after falling asleep, I woke up, but not where I fell asleep. I was now in the general common area rather than in the operating room. Additionally, I also noticed I was in my normal clothes rather than the hospital gown I put on prior to surgery. I also had a new splint that was also somehow even more comfortable than the one the pediatrician put on me at his office. Also by my bed were Mom, Dad, the pediatrician, and the surgical team, all waiting for me to wake up. When I did, they helped me onto a recliner and got me some goldfish and a soda. However, I was still high from the anesthesia, so I was still really tired and also said some really hilarious things that neither I nor my parents remember. The surgical team then talked to my parents, and after a little bit, they got me onto a wheelchair, helped me into Mom's van, and then we headed back home. The rest of the night was forgettable, as I couldn't really do much since I was high, so I think at around 9 o'clock, I fell asleep on my recliner. However, I ended up waking up at 4 a.m. to some excruciating pain on my left elbow. By then, the anesthesia wore off, so I was no longer high and was back to my senses. However, this also meant that now I had pain in my left arm, and God, this hurt even more than when I jumped the tennis net. Like, this was probably the most excruciating physical pain I've ever experienced in my entire life. This hurt really bad. However, that's when an idea came to mind. What if I tried to distract myself from the pain? So I tested that by going to the kitchen with my DS, got a Pop-Tart and a soda, and played some Utopia. And sure enough, this actually worked. Like, I was able to distract myself from the pain, and it worked so well that about 30 minutes later, I no longer felt any pain, so this actually worked. As for the rest of the day, I spent playing Miitopia and just laying around. The next day, being Friday, April 6th, oh boy, this is a pretty awesome day. So that night, Mom and Dad decided to follow through my therapist's recommendation and give me my phone back. We had a pretty serious discussion about being online and all that stuff. They also asked that I go into my YouTube videos and disable comments on all of them, so I went in and did that, which is also why many of my older videos have comments disabled. They also asked that I delete my Google+, which I did. Then, a little bit later, we had visitors. Those visitors being Alex and his parents. They came over with a little care package that included a king-size Kit Kat, bag of goldfish, can of peanuts, and a family-sized bag of Doritos. Then they spent the next 2 hours with us. His parents hung out with mine while Alex and I was on my computer, probably watching hentai or something since we both love anime titties. But nonetheless, I was in a super good mood since not only was I seeing Alex, but I even had company in general. After a little while, Alex and his parents took off. They said bye, wished me a speedy recovery, and then they took off. Afterwards, I stayed up to 3 AM playing Miitopia and eating snacks, all while feeling comforted by the fact that Alex and his family came over and hung out with me, which I definitely needed after going through surgery and being cut out from the outside world without my phone. And with that, Easter break was over and it was time to go back to school. My first day back was Monday, April 9th, so let's talk about this day, since it was of course my first day of school in a splint. Now, before I get there, pretty much everyone knew that my arm was broken since my science teacher told everyone, so nobody was too surprised to see me and Win wearing a splint, although I still got quite a bit of attention, as expected with someone with a broken arm. A lot of people offered to help me with my stuff, which I definitely needed since while I could carry a Chick-fil-A bag, I couldn't carry binders and books, so a lot of people offered to help me out with my stuff and also talk to me, including some girls, which felt really nice. English was also kind of forgettable. Like with every class, I received quite a bit of attention and stuff, but nothing too memorable in this class. So let's move on to science. This was a really fun class that day. Of course, our pre-class checkups, my teacher talked to me about my arm, asked how I was doing, all the usual. However, during class was when the real fun happened. So as mentioned, I was popular in this class. After getting my class switched, everyone in this class looked out for me and made sure I was included, as well as simply just befriended me. So knowing that my arm was broken, we joked about the entire class. Like, during the first half of class, our teacher was doing a lecture about pandemics and epidemics, which weren't as mainstream back then since this was 2 years prior to COVID-19, and one kid literally asked, do these make people jump tennis nets? Me and everyone else laughed, including our teacher, and this went on throughout the class. Like, every question someone asked had to do with me and my arm. I think I laughed more in this class than any class I've ever attended. Then came PE. So of course, since I had a broken arm, I could no longer do PE. In fact, I could no longer do PE for the rest of the school year. Therefore, for the rest of the school year, I would report to my algebra teacher's room, where I would basically chill and do schoolwork, play Clash Royale, or mess around, whichever one I felt like. After the quote-unquote PE time was finished, I went to lunch with my teachers. Now, even though I could still use my right arm, Seabird started cleaning my side of the table for me, so I was no longer cleaning until my splint came off, which wouldn't be too long. Then came algebra, which honestly didn't have much happening in regards to my arm, and then art. Now, art was rather interesting because of course only having one hand, I couldn't really do much when it came to arts and crafts. However, throughout the month of April, our teacher had the class participate in an art intensive where we basically created any real object. I chose to create a paper mache Dorito. Why? I have no idea. But for the next month, I would work on this thing and using orange paper mache and a fuck ton of newspapers to make a 2x2x2 foot long Dorito. And in the end, it looked really well, especially by the fact that I made it with a broken arm. I still have this Dorito today as a reminder of just how much I'm capable of when I really put my mind to something. Then once Mom took me over to her school, we had an hour to kill until swim practice. Well, for Zoe. I still had to go with her, so I went to practice with her, where I sat out and worked on schoolwork or played Clash Royale. However, these were always so obnoxious because of my coach. Every single practice, he would come up and ask me when I would be able to swim again. I always told him I didn't know, which seemed to always displease him. And it also pissed him off because it showed that he didn't care about me or my broken arm. He just cared about me getting back into the water and swimming. Like, the first questions he should have asked were, "Are you okay?" or "How is your arm doing?" Not, "When will you get back to swimming?" This made it all the more obvious that he was an egotistical asshole who only cared about his sport rather than his team. Like, I'm sure if I had actually committed suicide on March 8th, the only reason he would be upset would be because that meant one less swimmer on the team, and not because a teammate died. What an absolute heartless dick. So yeah, that was the first day back with my arm. Let's talk about academics before I get to the second church trip I want to discuss in the story time. So for 8th grade science, we did a project. For it, we had to create a presentation on a pandemic or epidemic of our choice. Once again, this was before COVID-19, so most people weren't as familiar with the stuff. Anyways, we also got to work on these in groups. I chose to work with my friend Ryan, who also joined me and Robbie in Pokemon Showdown streams. We decided to do our presentation on the bubonic plague from 1347 to 1353 because back in world history, we actually went into pretty big detail about this pandemic that wiped out about an entire third of the European population. Therefore, this is not a hard presentation to do at all since we knew the facts. We just needed to find sources to validate them. So this is pretty easy to work on. Now, we also had to present these, so I'll let Ryan do most of the technical stuff on the presentation, so things like presentation quality and controlling the slides, while I did most of the talking and presenting. This system worked really well since both of us knew what we were doing, and we both received 100 on this project. Then in algebra, we finished our last few lessons and could finally move on to review. Originally, we were going to go over 8th grade math topics now discussed in Algebra 1, but because of that law that was passed back in January, we didn't have to take the 8th grade math VOG. So therefore, we had a whole month and a half to review Algebra 1 topics until our exam. However, let's just say that the review stuff was really easy. Like, as we reviewed, I began to remember everything very well and was able to do everything. I think a lot of this was because now that I was no longer depressed, I could do the math with a clear mind. Additionally, we often utilized many techniques learned at the beginning of the class to the later chapters, so a lot of this stuff was very rudimentary, and as a result, I would do really well in algebra for the 4th quarter, even going as far as making an A in this quarter. Additionally, Earth Environmental Science got easier too, so midway through the month, I learned that my teacher was fine with me watching a YouTube video of the experiment and doing my lab based on it. Of course, most of this was because of my arm, but I was also able to do this for every future lab in the course, so this class became much easier and the labs no longer had me frustrated. Then we have art. So while making the Dorito, there was also an incident I had with Sir, who was one of the main 2 bullies alongside the football. Now, Sir usually couldn't do much to me in art since I had shared it with Ryan. However, on one day in particular, Ryan was not there, so Sir could do all the shit that he wanted. Anyways, while I was at work, Sir dropped a cardboard box near me and said that this was going to be where I was going to live in 10 years. I don't remember if I said something to him or what, but afterwards, he made the cardboard samurai, he made this cardboard a samurai sword using that box and then hit me right in my left arm, which hurt a ton because this was the one that I broke really badly. He then got a few swings in before our teacher got him off and told him to stop. She was a super passive teacher who honestly is part of the reason this happened, since she would have been useless if the class rebelled or something like that. But Sir did not receive a punishment from this, but it was the last time we interacted. At least that happened. This is why I gave him the name Sir, since he was trying to act like a knight, with just in a very uncourteous manner by hitting a kid with a broken arm, which has gotta be one of the most fucked up things you could do, so fuck you, Sir. Now, speaking of violence, there's also a fight that happened. I'm not sure what day it happened, but the last of the 3 fights I'm going to discuss discussing in this story time, as well as the last fight I'll discuss in this whole series, happened sometime the week of April 9th. Anyways, this fight was a little different from the other 2 fights discussed, as this was a girl fight. In part 3, I talked about why I believe girl fights are worse than boy fights, which is because they pull hair and also get their teachers in trouble by baiting them into touching them. So therefore, you can kind of guess how this fight was heading. Now, unfortunately, I did not get to witness this fight, as it happened on the 1st floor of the 8th grade building. It happened in between the first half of science and PE, so pretty much right as I entered my algebra teacher's room. Now, whereas I got settled into my spot that I usually went to, I saw a whole crowd of students running past the classroom and to the 1st floor. While crowds were common during this time, it was more crowded than usual, so I knew something was up. My algebra teacher also noticed it too, so he went downstairs and saw 2 girls fighting. He couldn't break up fights due to his heart issues, but he was able to calm the spectators down and get additional teachers to take care of the fight. Now, I know all this because when he returned, my algebra teacher actually told me all the details of the fight. He mentioned that it was a girl fight and that while there wasn't any hair pulling or stripping, there were some punches and tackling occurring, as well as some slamming into lockers. So it's good that the fight didn't last too long. Otherwise, one of the girls might have had more bruises than they already had. So let's move on and talk about that Friday, being April 13th. April 13th and 14th are both days I consider amongst the best days of my life, and these days are very high on my list, being just as good as other downright amazing days such as June 23rd, 2018 and December 10th, 2021. Yeah, these were absolutely phenomenal days. However, on April 14th, I had what I consider to be the greatest moment of my entire life, as it would be when I had made the most important decision I've ever made and ever will make. But before I get to that, let's start with April 13th, as both that day at school and that night were unforgettable. So, this was a unique day at school because our school hosted a dodgeball tournament amongst the 8th grade teams. So that morning, we had our 3 core classes, PE, and lunch, and during the time that we usually had the second half of second block and third block, we had the dodgeball tournament. Now, it should be glaring that I did not participate in this tournament because if a ball hit my left arm, that would have hurt. Therefore, I sat out. The tournament was optional, by the way, as we had to sign up to participate. I remember this because I became a pretty big meme throughout the team for being the only boy who did not sign up. Every single boy other than me, as well as 3/4 of the girls signed up. So that was often the butt of many jokes regarding this. And with many of them being told in second block since I was already being joked about all the time. So this only made this class even more enjoyable. Anyways, the dodgeball tournaments was held in the gym. Us spectators sat in the bleachers while the participants, which also included our teachers, were on the court throwing balls. The girls who opted to sit out surrounded me and acted like bodyguards for me to make sure that a ball didn't hit my arm, so I didn't have to worry about a ball hitting me. Now, let's just say that I and the girls got really invested into this massive dodgeball game. We were all shouting as many cuss words and using as much derogatory language as we could. Like about every other word we said was fuck. Every third word we said was shit. Our teachers couldn't hear us since they were playing ball, and our algebra teacher was home since this was the day he stayed for the first half. So we could do this, and we had a lot of fun with it, just casually dropping F-bombs on enemy teams and had a fun aspect to it, and overall, we had an absolute blast watching this tournament. So yeah, that was a fun day at school, and to make things even better, that night would be an even better and far more memorable than that day at school. But before I get to that, I should discuss what happened in between the two things. So, after school, Mom took me over to the therapist's office as I had a therapy session that day. I don't remember what we discussed, all I remember is that it happened after school. Then Mom took me over to McDonald's and got me an early dinner, since it wouldn't be until 10 o'clock that night when I would eat again. Afterwards, she took me over to the church for the second of the 2 church trips I attended as an 8th grader. So this church trip is a weird one because it technically isn't a trip, but it does involve being away from home for 3 days and 2 nights, as well as of course doing stuff with the church, so I considered it as such. Anyways, this church trip was DNOW 2018. In part 3, I talked about a church trip I did with my old church called 180. DNOW worked very similarly to it, just that it was a lot more structured and a lot more going on, and I remember it way better than 180. Overall, DNOW 2018 was a fantastic church trip, and I consider it to be the best church trip I attended, so that kind of sets the mood for this trip. DNOW lasted from April 13th to April 15th, so the whole weekend from Friday to Sunday. Now, DNOW is a church trip where youth members basically stay at a church member's house, do Bible lessons, participate in big-ass sessions at church, do community service, and participate in a huge competition called Mega Relay. I'll discuss all this stuff as I explain this trip, since it might sound like a lot. However, a lot of this stuff was similar to Winter Retreat, so it's not like any of this stuff is completely new. But I'll explain this stuff first before I get to discussing DNOW. So, as mentioned, we stayed at a church member's house. Basically, there was a church family who took in each grade and gender. So there was a house for 7th grade girls, 7th grade boys, 8th grade girls, 8th grade boys, and so on. So of course I stayed with the 8th grade boys, although we could request to be with a different group, which I did for DNOW 2021, and I'll discuss how come in part 7. Now, where I stayed was interesting, as while all the other girls slept in the living, or obviously I wasn't with girls, I was with the guys, while all the other guys slept in the living room, the family we stayed with, who I'll refer to as caretakers, prepared me with my own room and a bed to accommodate for my broken arm, as my youth pastor made them aware of me. This proved to be extremely convenient, as while I mostly spent my time in the living room with the others, I had my own private room to retreat to when my social battery depleted, as well as my own private room to sleep in. Now, there was also a group leader for each group. Our group leader was a guy named Timmy. I'm not sure what his story was, as he didn't even go to our church, but throughout D-Now, we participated in 3 group sessions, where Timmy came over and gave us a lesson during each and worked on our chant, which I'll get to in a bit. I should also mention that while my church hosted D-Now, it was not the only church participating, as there were 13 other churches in the area participating in D-Now. All 13 of these churches had their separate groups, but they all congregated for Big Ass Sessions and Mega Relay. Now, with regard to Big Ass Sessions, they weren't full-blown concerts like the ones at Winter Retreat, but we did have a band from Little Rock, Arkansas come and play music. They were pretty good, so I have to give it to them. Additionally, we had a preacher from Winston-Salem give the lessons for Big Ass Sessions. Now that you kind of get the idea, let's discuss D-Now 2018. So, after getting McDonald's, Mom dropped me off at church with my suitcase. One of my friends happened to be outside, so when he saw me, he came over and offered to get my stuff for me, which I greatly appreciated. He then took my stuff over to the 8th grade boys' room where everyone else's stuff was, while I went to the youth cafe where everyone else was. This was actually a table reserved for me in the cafe due to my arm, so I went over there, ate, while a few friends came over and hung out with me. We mostly just joked around and played Geometry Dash. Then a couple hours later, which felt only like a couple minutes, we were all let into the church gym. It might seem unusual that my church had a gym, but I went to a pretty large church with a large kids and youth program, since my church believed that having kids is compulsory. One of the biggest doctrinal reasons I left this church, as well as the Southern Baptist Church entirely, so us having a gym kind of makes sense. By the way, I'll go into greater detail about why I despise my old church, as well as evangelical denominations as a whole in parts 5 and 6. Anyways, the gym was decorated all around in Super Mario attire, as the pop culture for the theme this year's D-Now was Super Mario. So on the stage, there was a huge background of World 1-1 from the original Super Mario Bros., a whole bunch of item boxes hanging from the ceiling, as well as stars with the Super Mario 64 texture, a life-size go-kart painted to look like one from Mario Kart, and just like a whole bunch of, my music stopped for some reason. Okay, there we go. And just a whole lot of other really neat, cool details from the games. I really like this theme, which you'd expect since my top 3 favorite video games are all Mario games, being Super Mario Galaxy, Super Mario Galaxy 2, and Super Mario Odyssey. But I think even if I wasn't a Mario fan, I still really like this theme since they did a fantastic job setting it up and making us feel like we're in the world of Mario. Now, in addition to a pop culture theme, D-Now also had a biblical theme about the lessons that were centered around. This year's theme was togetherness, so the lessons we had were based around this theme. Just like all the other church trips I attended excluding D-Now 2021, I do not remember any of the lessons from this trip. I just know that they revolved around togetherness since that was the theme this year. If you've seen Storytime 29 or 49, then this theme will come off as very ironic, and I'll explain how come in part 5. Anyways, me and my group sat at the very front towards the right. I actually had a special seat at the very end of the row reserved, so I could have space for my arm, so I sat there. However, the band was also playing at D-Now was actually standing over near where I sat, as they were soon going to be coming up on stage and playing. They noticed me and struck up a conversation with me. They basically asked how I was feeling, as well as asked about my arm too. A little while later, the announcer for D-Now got on stage. I'm not sure what the church he went to was or what his story was, but he did a great job hyping us up and started off by introducing us to the event and playing some games. For his first game, he called up a few people up on stage. I managed to get called up, so I got to go up there and play the game. Normally I would refuse since I'm not a big fan of being in front of people, but I was in the mood at this particular moment, so I decided to go for it anyway. Now, I do not remember what game I played, but I do know that I won, as I received a signed copy of a book that Preacher for Big Ass Sessions wrote. I still have that book with me, although I've barely looked through it. After the games, they then played an introductory video for the event. This video basically had all the youth pastors of every church attending dressed as Mario characters and driving in go-karts. I believe my youth pastor was just dressed as Mario. Anyways, it then showed them racing and even dropping bananas, throwing shells, picking up mushrooms, and with the power of editing, them picking up stars and going really fast while wrecking fellow youth pastors. It was a really well made and really funny video that very accurately depicted Mario Kart. They even had the Mario and Luigi circuit theme from Mario Kart Wii playing in the background. It was a pretty funny video, and ultimately, my youth pastor won the race. Afterwards came the band. The band came on stage, played some songs. Afterwards, the preacher came up, gave his sermon. And then we were done with Big Ass Session 1. Me and my group then went to downstairs to get our stuff, where we also met with Timmy and our caretakers. Well, everyone else carried their stuff. I didn't have to carry anything since the whole group collectively carried one thing I was bringing for me. to put it in the wife's van, which I greatly appreciated. Of course, I also rode in the wife's van with I think 7 others in a group. I, of course, was given the front seat so I wouldn't have to cram in with everyone, and the others in the group were in the husband's truck, since there were 13 of us total. Then once we got to the caretaker's house, we got unpacked. The caretakers got my stuff for me and also showed me where my room was, so I now knew where I was going. Then once I got settled, I joined the rest of the group in the living room where they were all staying. A little while later, Timmy arrived. He gave us an individual group lesson, and then afterwards, he introduced our chant. So each group was assigned to come up with a little chant that they would showcase to the rest of the other groups that Sunday. So Timmy's idea for this chant was that each of us hold up the item boxes that were on stage for the big ass sessions. Each box had a letter that spelled togetherness, so everyone would hold one box except me, since I of course could not hold a box. Instead, I would hit each box, and when I did, the holder of the respective box I would hit would hold his box over his head. We then would do all this while we chanted the phrase, "If we want to be effective, then we have to be together." While the chant was overall really cringy, the phrase is actually really catchy, so I gotta give it to Timmy for this one. Like when me and Seaburn discussed this event, who by the way also attended D now with his church, I told him what our chant was and it stayed stuck in his head for a long time. Too bad me and Seaburn were likely the only ones who still remembered this chant after D now, as we'll see the chant not be put to practice at Fuge. Afterwards, Timmy then left and went back home, while we all had the rest of our night to ourselves. One of the boys brought his PS4, so we hooked it up to the living room TV and pulled up Fortnite. This was back when Fortnite was really big and super popular. Like, I was the only boy in the whole group who did not play Fortnite, and I'm proud to say I've never been a Fortnite player, although I have played a couple games, so if you know what I mean. Additionally, I also had snacks on hand. Mom brought with me 12-pack case of Dr. Pepper, 2 family-sized bags of Pop-Tarts, and 2 cases of Doritos, or 2 bags of Pop-Tarts, meant 2 cases of, I mixed them up. So I had all the snacks I wanted, and by the end of the weekend, I had no leftovers, so I ate and drank almost everything, so I was pretty much living the life. Ultimately, I stayed up to 2:30 that night with the boys. I didn't play any Fortnite myself, I just watched them play, talked to them, and ate snacks, but at 2:30, I was tired. So I went to my room and rested up. Some of the boys ended up not sleeping whatsoever this trip, which I certainly couldn't nor wanted to, so I went to sleep. Then I was woken up by the wife at 8 o'clock. She also provided breakfast in bed, so I ate breakfast while we talked for a little while. Then once I finished, she helped me put my sling on and took the dishes to the sink. I then went to the living room and joined everyone else. At around 9 o'clock, Timmy came over and provided his second group lesson and also worked with us on our chant. Afterwards, he actually joined us and even played a couple games of Fortnite. Then at 11, we headed over to church, where we had our second big-ass session. This big-ass session differed from the others, as the preacher did not give a sermon. However, we still had the games and the band played some songs. But midway through the big-ass session, they played one of the best trolls on me, only rivaled by Scenario 4, which I'll explain near the end of part 7. Anyways, they did this theme called Panda Exercise. Here they had a panda do stretches, and of course we were to follow the panda as he did them. Of course I couldn't do them since I had a broken arm, so while everyone was doing the stretches, I was shouting an even longer strain of cuss words than I was at the dodgeball tournament from the day before while my group was laughing at me. Afterwards, the band played some more songs, and then we were dismissed to our missions. So for missions, each group was assigned a mission where they basically did stuff for the community. So some groups cleaned school buses, some did yard works for elderly couples, some planted bushes and trees for local schools. As for my group, we cannot do yard work or anything labor intensive because of me. Therefore, my group's assignment mission was to purchase 3 cakes and give them to people working in local small businesses. So pretty much, we got to be Mr. Beast for a couple hours. Anyways, the first place we delivered a cake was a local pizzeria. We basically just gave a cake to the guy working at the front, got a picture with him, and prayed him over him. Second place we went to was a local barbershop. The owner was actually there chilling since he didn't have anyone, so we gave him a cake, took a picture with him, and prayed over him. Then we went to this one that I remember the most, being a local furniture store. The owner was working behind the counter, so we gave her a cake, took our picture of her, and prayed over her. However, the reason I remember this one well is because while Timmy was talking to the owner, me and the rest of the group toured the store and messed around. I chose to lay on a bed while playing Clash Royale, while some of the other boys were running around and having a good time. Once we finished, we then made our way back to the house, where Timmy provided us with some brown t-shirts with red ties on them. The reason we were given these shirts was because we were about to participate in Mega Relay. So Mega Relay, or Mega as I'll refer to it as, is this big church event hosted at D Now where all the groups at all churches competed against each other in this big relay competition. The church set over at the local high school soccer field, so they had a ton of space to work with. Anyways, each group was assigned a Mario character to kind of dress up as for Mega. My group was assigned Donkey Kong, so that's why we wore brown shirts and red tie. Now, as you might expect, I did not participate in Mega, as this was a physically demanding event that involved pushing, running, crawling, and a whole bunch of other stuff I couldn't do with a broken arm. Therefore, I sat on a hill overlooking the event. Thankfully, I wasn't completely alone, as one of Zoe's friends, whose parents were very involved with the church and chaperoned D Now, came over and hung out with me. She talked with me and also watched me play Clash Royale while Mega was going on. Ultimately, my group did not win Mega. I believe it was the 9th grade girls at our church who won, which actually doesn't surprise me since I believe everyone in that group played a sport, but at least everyone had a blast and I had fun playing Clash Royale. Afterwards, we had our third and final big-ass session of D Now. Now, this was a really special one and the most memorable one I had, as this session would be when I made by far the greatest and most important decision I've ever made and ever will make, ever. So while the preacher was giving his sermon, I'm not sure what he was talking about, but I heard a voice. It said something on the lines of, "Zach, you've been through so much over the past few months. Why not have a change? Repent of your sins and follow me, and I will grant you eternity." I was very quickly picked up that this was God's voice, as the voice was so majestic and calming that no human could be capable of saying. I didn't answer the calling by praying, "God, I know you are there. All of my life, I've learned about the things you have done and how you have sent your one and only son to die for me. I accept you with all my heart and all I've done, with all that I have." At that moment, my name was written in the book of life, and I am now a completely different person. No longer was I the Zachary James Brainerd who tried to kill himself or the Zachary James Brainerd who lashed out wraths. I was now the Zachary James Brainerd who was saved by the blood of Christ. And wow, the feeling I got the moment that I accepted Christ was just downright supernatural. Like, I genuinely could feel the Holy Spirit entering my heart and felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. Even though it was similar to how I felt the moment I was cured of depression, those two can't even be compared, as this feeling was by far greater than that one. Like, I've never had or will ever have an experience this amazing. This is how I personally know God is real and why I continue to stay a Christian today, even after all the shit that I've been through from church and how badly I've been treated by my church. It's also why no matter what you do to me, I will never deny my faith, as in the 5.5 years I've been saved, I have not denied my faith once, and nor will I ever deny it, as I am saved by the blood of Christ and I am very proud of it. Now, usually when this happens, you're supposed to go around and tell literally everyone what you just did. For me, however, I chose to keep this personal. I only told my youth pastor, Timmy, and texted my parents. They were all incredibly happy and filled with joy knowing that I made this monumental decision. The others in my group would learn about my decision a month later when I publicly confessed my faith in the form of baptism, which I'll discuss when we get there, when we get to May. And then after the big ass session, we went back to the caretaker's house, where Timmy gave us one last group session and worked on our chant, and then we were on our own. Now, as I mentioned and when I discussed March 8th, emotions are powerful. Giving your life to Christ is one of the most emotional things you can do, and for me, this was by far the most emotional moment I ever attended to this day as whole, as well as the third most emotional day I've ever had, only behind March 8th, 2018 and December 10th, 2021. Therefore, I cannot stay up for very long, as I only went to bed at midnight. I also remember that night having an incredibly good dream. In it, I saw many of my dead relatives, including my grandfather who died back in 2016, my aunt who committed suicide in 2013, my grandmother who died in 2009, and my great-grandmother who passed away in 2006. All of them congratulated me on my decision and all gave me a huge hug, sounding how much I had grown and also how proud they were of me for getting through depression. They then mentioned that God used my depression for His glory. It was because I went through that experience that I was able to find God and ultimately give my life to Him, which is so ironic because on March 8th, Mom said that God was going to one day use this for His glory, and He did it just now. Afterwards, they then wished me well and my new life and said that they look forward to seeing me in heaven whenever my day came. I then woke up almost in tears. This is probably the best dream that I've ever had in my entire life. Seeing my dead relatives was a super emotional but heartwarming experience that just made me so happy. I do miss them, and I'm absolutely ready to see them whenever I die, as I know they're looking over me and watching me progress through life. I didn't wake up at 7:30, so I at least had some time to think things over before the day started. So I just laid in bed for the next 30 minutes, thinking about my dream and my decisions from the night before. Then at 8, the wife came in with breakfast in bed and we talked for a little bit. Once I was finished, she helped me with my sling and then I joined the others in the living room. Then at 9:30, we headed off to church. We started with youth, where all of the D-Now groups gathered and we all did our chants. Of course, we did ours. If we wanted to be effective, then we have to be together bullshit, and it was really cringy. But we got through it and also took group pictures and youth-wide pictures with everyone who participated. And afterwards, we went to the 11 o'clock worship service. Normally, me and my family went to the 8:30 service, since my parents and Zoe are big morning people, which is why being the only night owl in your family sucks. So it was nice not having to hear our preacher yell so early in the morning. Overall, this was a usual church service with not much happening, but after the service, I reunited with my parents and went home. So yeah, that was D-Now 2018. By far, as well as the most important church trip I ever attended. It was also a really fun one. Even though I didn't get to participate in Mega, I still had a lot of fun hanging out with my group, most of whom I had second block with, and just had a lot of fun and of course made the greatest decision I've ever made. So with that finished, let's get back to school. So on Wednesday, April 18th, my team went on a field trip to a baseball game at a local college. Well, they did. I chose not to go on this field trip for 2 reasons. For one, it was going to be really hot that day, so it would have been really uncomfortable for my arm, as I remember getting really uncomfortable during Mega. And 2, I didn't want a baseball hitting my arm, so therefore, I decided not to go. It also helped that the bullies were all going, so me sitting out meant that I would reduce the chances of me seeing them. Therefore, I chose to stay at school and did quote-unquote makeup work. Although really, I played cool math games the entire time like any other 8th grader would. So for it, I went to my algebra teacher's room with the others who weren't attending. However, right as I entered the room, I noticed that Robbie was dancing around. Robbie was the one who threw a chair and also joined me and Ryan in Pokemon Showdown streams. Anyways, Robbie was doing a Fortnite dance when all of a sudden, his foot got caught up in a desk leg and he ended up falling. When he hit the floor, he went into agonizing pain and could not get back up. 911 ended up being called and Robbie was taken on a stretcher. Ultimately, Robbie ended up dislocating his knee. Thankfully, it wasn't as serious as mine, as he had much of a speedier recovery than I did, and he didn't need surgery either. Speaking of injuries, the next day was also a big day, as I had my follow-up appointment with the pediatrician. Well, not exactly him, but his assistant, as he was out of town. So mom picked me up early from school that day and we went to Charlotte to get my arm checked out. The assistant took more x-rays on my arm and determined that I no longer needed a splint. However, he wanted me to regain my strength in my left arm back, so therefore, I didn't even have to put on a cast. Instead, for the next month, I would be doing physical therapy on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. This was good news for me, since not only was I going to get strength in my arm, but I was also getting to sit out of swim practice, so I didn't have to deal with my coach bitch about when I was going to be back at swimming, so this worked out well. So from then until near the end of May, I would do physical therapy at a nearby place from mom's school. She would take me directly there after school, and then take Zoe to swim practice, although our coach still bitched at mom asking when I was returning just to be an egotistical piece of shit, but at least I was no longer having to hear from him until June. As for the sessions, they weren't as bad as I initially thought. At first, I thought they were gonna hurt. However, they were pretty easy and caused little pain. Like, most of the time, I just spent playing Clash Royale while the therapist messed with my arm, and it worked well, so these weren't bad at all. But oddly enough, I'd occasionally see Robbie, as because his knee recovered quickly, he was able to go to physical therapy soon. So we occasionally had therapy together, which was always really cool seeing him. And with that, that's all that really happened this month. April 2018 was an absolutely amazing month that really showed just how awesome Post-Depression Period Part 1 was. It certainly was a breath of fresh air after all that happened first quarter of the year. So with that, let's move on to May. May 2018 was interesting, as it was honestly a low point during this time period. I was still really happy overall, but there was some pretty bad stuff that happened midway through that kinda hurt this month. But the good stuff that happened was really good, so that made up for the middle of the month. Anyways, to start, let's discuss a field trip that I did participate in this time. So every year, my school took the 8th graders to Wilmington, the largest coastal city in North Carolina, as well as a big historical city with a lot of cool stuff to see. It's about an hour and a half north of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, in case you're not familiar with where it's at. Now, this field trip was special because it was an overnight trip. In fact, we stayed down there from May 2nd to May 5th, so we did quite a bit and saw quite a lot. Anyways, the week prior, we created roommate groups. We were going to stay at a hotel that could contain 4 people each. I ended up staying in a room with Sebrin, a kid named Dale, and a kid who I've always referred to as Anonymous throughout Storytime, so I'll keep his identity secret and call him Anonymous in Storytime. He'll show up again later in Storytime as well as in parts 5 and 6, and I'll call him Anonymous in those Storytimes too. Then a week later came Wednesday, May 2nd. That morning, Dad took me to the school since he had to help me with my suitcases, as well as sign off on my medication. So helped me with that and talked with the chaperone there, and afterwards, I went to class. First half of the day was normal, as we did classes as we normally did. However, after lunch, all of us attending the trip were assigned a bus, and then we went to the classroom where everyone else was on our respective bus was. After getting through attendance and going over some rules, we then boarded the bus. Because we were going pretty far, the school rented out fancy charter buses like the ones we took during winter retreat. Therefore, it was back to the same luxuries that I had on the ride up there with portable chargers, comfortable seats, and movie players, just like being a nice ride in general. Anyways, we got boarded. None of my roommates were on the same bus as me, but none of the bullies were on the bus either, so I guess that made things even. But at least I'd still get to sit beside two friends I made in 7th grade, whose names were Todd and Michael. Both of them were really cool, and this was actually my first time talking to them since 7th grade, although I haven't talked to them since this trip. Now, me, Todd, and Michael had quite a bit of fun during our ride, and by fun, we pulled some pranks on each other. So about an hour into the trip, me and Michael decided to prank Todd. So Todd fell asleep. However, he left his music playing on his phone. So I took his phone and got into it since he didn't have any security measures. I then unplugged his earplugs, where I then handed his phone to Michael. Michael then pulled up a gay remix of Rockstar by Post Malone, where at the beginning of the 21 Savages part, he says, "I've been in the heels fucking dudes." I then set the phone back on Todd's lap, turned the volume all the way up, and then pressed play. Not only did the music wake Todd up, but it got everyone's attention since it was so loud. Right after 21 Savage said, "Dudes," everyone including me, Michael, the chaperones, the bus driver, and Todd himself started bawling laughing. In fact, Todd didn't even wake up in a scared phase. He just woke up calmly and then started laughing as he turned the music off. About an hour later, we stopped at Chick-fil-A for a break. I ate with my friends from church and had the usual chicken sandwich and the fries. Afterwards, we boarded the bus again to finish the field trip, but this time, Todd got back at me and Michael. So me and Michael were talking to this group of girls beside us. Well, I wasn't, as Michael was doing all the talking. I was just in the conversation listening. However, that's when Todd put his phone right up at our ears and started playing "Love Me Long Time" as loud as he could. If you've heard that song before, you know it's let's just say a rather interesting song. But just like we got Todd, we, as well as the whole bus, cried laughing at this. Me and Michael were the ones who got pranked, but both of us still thought it was funny, so did the rest of the class. Then at 5:30, we made it to the hotel. We then got our stuff on off the bus, united with our roommates, and handed our room keys. We then went to our room and got everything unpacked. Overall, our room wasn't anything too special. It had 2 king-size beds, a window, a desk, and a bathroom. It wasn't a beachfront or city front or anything like that, so we didn't get much of a view, but it still worked for the purpose it served. Anyways, after a while, we then boarded the buses again for our first activity, that being skating. So we went over there to a nearby skating rink and skated. Now, this was not very ideal for me, as due to my arm, I couldn't skate. In fact, my injury prohibited me from ever skating again, as even today, I still can't skate because if I fall the wrong way, it might mess up the metal wiring in my arm. That's why I said that the second 7th grade field trip was the last time I ever went and could skate back in part 3, since my injury permanently made me unable to do activities where you fall a lot. So therefore, I had to sit out on this one. But luckily, the rink also had arcade games, and to make things even better, my parents gave me $30 specifically for this, since they knew I wouldn't be able to skate. Thankfully, I wasn't the only one sitting out from skating, so I wasn't completely alone playing arcade games. Now, let's just say that I got really invested into the game where you stack blocks and try to build a tower as high as you could. I forgot what this game was called, but I got really into it and also got really consistent at it. So I kept playing it until I got an attempt that went really well. So basically, this game had 2 types of rewards. Minor rewards 3/4 of the way to the top, and major rewards at the very top, which are both pretty much self-explanatory. Anyways, this attempt went really well and much better than the others. I got the minor rewards and was therefore 3/4 of the way to the top. However, I decided I was going to go big and decided to go for a major reward. This got a lot of people's attention. In fact, right as I resumed the game, I think about 45 boys were now huddling around me. Like, people were getting off the ring just to watch me attempt the major reward. Now, usually, crowds make me really nervous, as it stimulates my autism and therefore makes me really nervous and more awkward. However, on this particular moment, I actually got an adrenaline rush, causing me to play even harder. So much better in fact that I got to the very last block with relative ease. But then once I reached the last block, everyone started doing a drum roll. That's when my adrenaline stopped and I began to get really nervous. I started shaking and sweating and almost having a panic attack. However, after taking a deep breath, I pressed the button at just the right time and managed to place the final block. Right as I placed it there, I and everyone around me went absolutely wild. We were all jumping up and down, shouting a whole bunch of incoherent shit, and just going absolutely ballistic. In fact, someone even tried to pick me up, although he quickly put me back down when he remembered that my arms were still somewhat broken. After we all calmed down a bit, I selected my reward, to which I selected the $50 bill. Once I got it, I then held it up as the whole crowd started cheering some more. Ultimately, I got a $35 profit from this game, which I was happy with, so I decided that it was time to stop and relax, which is what I did. I bought myself a pizza and then sat down and ate by myself to recharge my social battery. After a while, we then left the skating rink and headed back to the hotel. Seaburn happened to bring his PS4, so he whipped out GTA 5 and began streaming, as he had a YouTube channel that everyone at school knew about. In fact, Seaburn had the second most subscribers at our school at the time, with over 75 subscribers. I was actually first place, as I already had accumulated over 130 subscribers by then, but nobody knew about my channel since I didn't want my school knowing about it, as I was quite embarrassed about the content I was uploading, as well as of course death threats I received earlier that year. I'd at least tell Ryan and Robbie about my channel at the very end of the school year, but nobody else knew about my channel. But anyways, everyone else knew that Seaburn would be streaming, so all the boys' rooms and most of the girls' rooms had his stream pulled up and were all cheering us four on, since me, Dale, and Anonymous joined Seaburn in his streams. And we had an absolute blast interacting with each other and playing GTA 5, even if the stream had a few technical issues since the hotel Wi-Fi wasn't the best. But once all of us were tired, we turned off the stream and went to bed. Dale and Anonymous took the bed to the left while me and Seaburn had the bed to the right. So let's move on to Thursday, May 3rd. The hotel provided breakfast that morning, so we went down and ate breakfast. Afterwards, we headed out. We first went to Fort Fisher. This was a military base right off the beach used by the Confederacy during the Civil War. This is a very important and strategic commercial port for the Confederacy, so we got to walk around it and see a lot of cool stuff it had, as well as look at some stuff of the weapons that they used to defend this fort. Afterwards, we went to the Wilmington Aquarium. For this, the teachers pretty much let us tour around this place on our own, just that we had to be with our roommates. Unlike my experience at the Georgia Aquarium from part 2, I do not really remember my experience here, although I do remember Dale taking my picture in between the teeth of a megalodon fossil. That was cool. I also remember that we ate lunch at the aquarium and got to buy stuff from the gift shop if we had money. Of course, I was quite loaded with money after my big win from the previous night, so I decided to buy this $30 stuffed shark that, while it was pretty large, it was still really cute and fluffy, so I was happy to have purchased one. After our time at the aquarium, we did more of an academic part of the trip, where we met up with a marine biologist and were given a tour of a promontory that wasn't too far out from sea. Promontories are basically like small islands in shallower water in the ocean. They usually aren't too far out from the shore and are usually not inhabited by people, which explains why they're often used as nature reserves. The one that we went to in particular wasn't too far from Cape Fear, which we also got to see North Carolina's most prominent lighthouse. Anyways, to access this promontory, we had to use a boat, so we all got on the boat and sat down. During the ride up there, the marine biologist basically talked to us about this promontory, what all lived there, and what all he and his team were researching. I think he said that his team were researching seagulls and their beak adaptations, although I couldn't pay too much attention since I was more concerned about my glasses falling off the boat, as the wind was pretty intense. Once we got to the promontory, we got off and the marine biologist walked us around the island. This was actually a very naturally diverse landmass, as we walked around sand dunes, hills, and even tiny forests, as there were surprisingly a lot of trees on this island. Eventually, we reached the middle of the island, where we were going to help the marine biologist and his team out by finding some animals that lived in the river. So everyone jumped onto the river and started searching. Well, everyone except me. I of course had to sit out since I couldn't get my left arm wet, as I didn't want water to crawl through my scar. I'd at least get the chance to do a similar activity in part 6, which I'll talk more about in that story time. Afterwards, we made our way back to the boat and went back to Wilmington, where we then boarded the bus and went back to the hotel for a break. Now, while the promontory was very pretty, it did make my shoes really nasty. However, I had a 300 IQ moment in the room where I put my shoes in the bathtub and cleaned off the mud. It didn't even require soap or anything. I just had to scrub the mud off my shoes in warm water, and boom, they were good as new. My roommates caught on to this idea too, so they did the same thing after I was finished. After our break, we then went bowling. Now, unlike the skating rink where I had to sit out, I could bowl since I'm right-handed, so I was able to join in on the fun this night, although it isn't to say this night at the skating rink wasn't fun, since it was fun winning $50. But as for bowling, I don't remember much of what we did. I think me and my roommates bowled with a group of girls, although I don't really remember. Later that night, Seaburn pulled up his stream and we streamed more GTA 5, although we ended the stream sooner since we were all tired and worn out from the day before. So that brings me to Friday, May 4th, which was the last full day of the field trip. So that morning, we ate breakfast and got ready. We went to visited the USS North Carolina. In Storytime 40, I mistakenly called it the USS Wilmington. That is also a military boat, but is actually in Wilmington, Delaware. The USS North Carolina is the military boat stationed in Wilmington, North Carolina. Just want to clarify that for anyone who's seen Storytime 40. Anyways, the USS North Carolina was a huge battleship used during World War II and was present during many battles in the Pacific Ocean against Japan. So we got to tour this boat and got to see all the stuff on it. From machine guns at the top of the ship to the living corridors inside, we saw everything on this boat. It was pretty cool and quite surprising to know that this massive thing was once used in warfare. Afterwards, it was beach time. Well, not for our bus. The chaperones had to go to Walmart for something, and they spent a whole hour there, so really, we only got an hour of beach time. But nonetheless, beach time was fun. Dad brought with me a football since he knew that I wouldn't be able to play in the ocean or even interact much with the sand. And this football worked miracles because almost immediately when I pulled it out, a ton of boys, many of whom from my second block and cheered me on at the skating rink, came over and asked if they could play tag football. I said sure, and we all played tag football. I took a stick and marked touchdown lines, and we all paired ourselves into teams. Once we were set, we played. Of course, we played tag football since we didn't want to knock each other into sand, but everyone also wanted to went easy on me since I wouldn't damage my arm. This was a really fun game, and even though my team lost, I still enjoyed being able to do physical activities again. After a while, we headed back to the hotel for a break, and then for our nightly fun activity, where we had a party on a ferry that took us all the way to Cape Fear and back. Now, I have two stories regarding this party. The first one happened near the beginning of the ride. So in the main dance area of the ferry, there were a few poles. Now, being 8th graders, people made the connection between these poles and strippers. So while nobody took their clothes off, people did start dancing, and even did some rather sexual dances on those poles. But to make things even sillier, I and some others started taking we got our wallets out and started throwing money at them like they were an actual strip club. All of us died laughing. Eventually though, the teachers intervened and told us to stop, probably because they were getting hard themselves. I thankfully retrieved a lot of the money that I threw, so I didn't take a loss and still got a good kick from this. A little while later, once everyone was settled, the ferry became a full-blown dance club. People were dancing all over the ferry, music was loud, and it was crowded. And this did not suit me very well, as I got really nervous and hid near the top of the ferry where there were less people and it wasn't as loud. But once I felt better, I went back to where the party was and saw that there was a flip-off occurring, bringing me to my second story from this ferry ride. So in my grade, we had two boys known for being really good at flipping. From front flips to back flips to double flips. They could do any kind of flip. So they both got to the center of the dance floor while me and everyone else crowded around them to witness the most hype part of the entire trip. Now, how this flip-off worked was that each boy took turns doing a flip. The winner was determined by who made the audience cheer the loudest. However, I think this ended up being a tie, as both boys had me and the audience making a ton of noise. In fact, we were cheering on so loudly that I couldn't even hear the music since we were so loud. Both of them did backflips, and both flips were pretty awesome. So yeah, this was the hypest part of the trip, and even though I hate parties, I still enjoyed myself at this one, except for when I got really overwhelmed midway through. Anyways, we then went to the hotel where me and my roommates went straight to bed since we were all worn out from that day, and then the next day, we got up and headed back to school. Now, of course, being a Saturday, nobody was there, so being picked up by our parents wasn't too difficult. Mom was waiting in line, and once I got in, she greeted me and we talked for a little bit about the trip. However, We were roughly halfway home when Mom handed me a letter, saying that I was going to really love what was inside. So I opened it up and saw that it came from the early college I applied to. I then started reading, and once I read the first line, a huge smile formed on my face as I read, "Congratulations! We, the early college staff, are pleased to offer you admission." Back in February, I applied to go to an early college so I would not only get 2 years of college done in high school and for free, but also to be around others like me and to get away from the drama and the bullies from 8th grade. And right here and there, I had been offered admission to the school. The school only has a 25% acceptance rate, meaning that the odds were against me, but defying all odds, I got accepted and would officially attend early college for high school. This was also the 9th change that I mentioned earlier when discussing what changed after my discharge from the mental hospital. I chose to wait until now to talk about it, since at the time, I was still expecting to go to a regular public high school because early college has a low acceptance rate. But yeah, I was accepted at early college and now as an alumnus, I have to say, I had an absolutely amazing early college experience, as not only were the people I was there like me, aka people who wanted to learn and were driven, but I also got to be taught under some incredible teachers, and I would ultimately go on to be a legend at the school, as I'm still often talked about and looked up to at the school even 2 years after I graduated. Of course, parts 5 and 8 will all take place at the school, so I'll talk a little bit more about those in those times. Anyways, I'll go ahead and skip over to the little acceptance party they held for students who got accepted and were interested in attending that they held on May 22nd. So, 3 teachers took 1/3 of the class each. The teacher I was with would go on to be my 9th and 11th grade English teacher, as well as my crew leader, which I'll explain more about and talk about her a ton in parts 5 and 8, since she played a massive role in my development in high school, and would be the teacher who inspired me to write The Charm, as well as who I dedicated my book to. Anyways, we were all then split into groups of 5 since there were 20 of us in the section. I was in a group with Anonymous and 3 girls. Anonymous and one of the other 3 girls left the early college after 10th grade, while me and the other 2 girls became really close friends, and we often talk about this event today since it's where we initially met. Anyways, we had to make a shelter using materials designed for shelter making. I don't think our group was successful, but it was still a really fun activity that got us to know each other and build teamwork. Our parents actually did this same thing, and mine weren't successful either. And yeah, this was the acceptance party. It was fun and it was a really funny thing to talk about, since I'd gone on to have such a huge impact at early college, as well as become completely different from my first day of high school, August 6, 2018, to my last day of high school, December 10th, 2021. Once again, this change will be discussed much more in detail in parts 5 through 8, so y'all can watch those to see how high school had me transformed. Speaking of transformations and growth, let's backtrack a bit to Sunday, May 13th. So this was a very special day because not only was it Mother's Day, but it was also the day that I got baptized. Now, my baptism was actually a rocky road, not necessarily because of how I came to know Christ, since I had to go through hell and back for that, but more setting up my baptism from when I got saved to the baptism ceremony. Much of this had to do with my arm, as I couldn't get it wet. That's why I was still taking baths instead of showers, even though my splint was removed, since I couldn't get my scar on my left arm wet. However, during our meeting with the pediatrician's assistant, he said that as long as I waited 3 weeks, it would be fine for my arm to go into fresh, clean water, just that I couldn't swim in it. So alas, I was finally able to be baptized almost a full month after being saved. And I've got to say, my experience being baptized was just downright magical. After he finished the sermon, the preacher asked if I would go to the back with him, so I did and talked to him. He didn't explain how it would work and what the Bible said and the technique was, although my case is a little different due to my arm. Rather than pushing a cloth with both my hands against my face, I only used my right hand, while my left hand stayed rested since of course it was broken. Anyways, I put on one of those baptism robes and then walked into the pit with the preacher. There, he made some comments about me, my journey to find Christ, although to my request, he didn't mention my mental health, and shouted out my family. This was especially funny when he called on my Aunt Shayla, who he called Sheila. To this day, I still give my aunt a hard time about it, using the excuse, the preacher said it, so it's definitely right. Although I can't exactly use that excuse anymore since I've since left this church and the Southern Baptist denomination entirely. But anyways, the preacher didn't ask me if I was a follower of God, to which I confidently replied with, "I sure am," which actually impressed him since usually people were scared and said yes in a nervous tone. But afterwards, I placed a cloth on my face and then he sunk me into the water. Interestingly, unlike a lot of other people who were not fans of being pushed in the water, I personally didn't mind since I was used to holding my breath underwater thanks to swimming and doing backstroke. But only a second later, I was pulled back to the surface, where I sat the cloth down and heard the congregation clap for me. Me and the preacher then hugged, and then I went and drived off and changed into my normal clothes. Overall, this experience was absolutely magical and just majestic. I ended up getting the same feeling I had when I gave my life to Christ. Although not as supernatural as that one, since baptism is just a confession of faith and doesn't actually save you. One of the few things I just do agree with Baptists on. It's when you give your life to Christ, that's when you're actually saved. That day after church, though, my parents threw a family party for me to celebrate. Alright, so let's get back to school. So at the end of May, exam season began. I had 4 exams that I was taking, although I only took 1 exam in May, and then I took the other 3 in June. Now, before I discuss exams, I should mention that the 3 types of exams that I took this school year. So the first one, as well as one I already took for world history, was the North Carolina Final Exam, or NCFE, as I refer to it as, and will refer to it as for the rest of the story time. NCFEs work basically just like my world history final, where they are short, generally 40-question tests and are graded on accuracy. So of course I made a 94 on it, which was my actual score. I took an NCFE for Earth Environmental Science, which I'll get to later. Then there are end-of-grade tests, or EOGs as we call them. EOGs are given for math and English from grades 3 to 8, so this was the last year I took an EOG. Although this year, I would not take an EOG for math since I took Algebra 1, since that new law passed to say that we didn't have to take the one for 8th grade math EOG if we were taking Algebra 1. However, 5th and 8th graders also have to take an EOG for science, which is why we still have to take 8th grade science. Therefore, I would take an EOG for English and science this year. Now, EOGs were graded on a scale of 1 to 5. Similar to AP exams where 1 means you're a dumbass, 3 means you're average, and 5 means you're smarter than 80% of the state. So the EOGs, I refer to them by that scale since they weren't graded percentage-wide, although they were still great scales so you could see how much better you did compared to a percentage of 8th graders in the state, which I'll explain later. Now, the third type of test that I took this year were end-of-course tests, or EOCs as we called them. Basically, at the time, EOCs were only given out for Algebra 1, Biology, and English 2. But the next year, they started doing an EOC for Algebra 2. All the other high school courses had NCFEs. But, funnily enough, I would actually only ever take 2 EOCs and only 3 NCFEs during my time in high school since the COVID-19 pandemic started when I was in 10th grade, which was when I took Biology and English 2. There was also something really funny that happened with the Algebra 2 EOC when I took it in 9th grade. But I'll talk more about these exams in Part 6 and 5 respectively. But anyways, EOCs work similarly to EOGs where they were long, usually 75-question exams, and although instead of being graded based on a scale of 1 to 5 like EOGs, they were graded based on a percentage of how well you did compared to the rest of the state. So if you scored 80% higher than the rest of the state, then you got an 80 for the EOC, which counted 20% of our grade in this class. Speaking of which, the only exam I took in May was the Algebra 1 EOC, so let's talk about it. I took this test on May 29th, so we were all separated into whichever block we had algebra for. So me and the others who had algebra for 3rd block went into our science teacher's room to take this test, while those who had algebra for 1st block went to our English teacher's room. Meanwhile, our algebra teacher had his 8th grade math students, where they all took the 8th grade math EOG. So once our science teacher got through the script that she was required to read, we could then begin the exam, which was online. Now, another thing too about exams this year was that this was the first time the state administered standardized tests online, as every other EOG or NCFE that I had taken up to this point was paper and pencil except the 5th grade science EOG, which I discussed in Part 1, as well as the NCFEs for computers and technology, but of which I talked about in Part 3. So this was definitely a very unique way of taking a test. Alright, so now let's talk about taking the exam itself. So this just might have been one of the dumbest standardized tests I've ever taken. Algebra 1 was the hardest class I've ever taken, and I still fully believe this as a senior accounting and economics student in college. However, the EOC for it was a complete joke. Like, it was so easy, I was breezing through problems, and I barely even used my calculator on the calculator active section. The calculator inactive section did provide me some struggle since I wasn't used to factoring, meaning I still had to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratics without a calculator, and that was frustrating. but considering I memorized square roots, that wasn't all that bad. A lot of this was mostly just cause I no longer was depressed and dealing with mental health issues, so I could come in with a clear mind and actually do my best work. And pretty quickly, I got through the exam, submitted it, and then my teacher came and got my stuff. I was now officially done with the hardest class I'd taken. Then once time was up, our teacher read the rest of her script. Then at the very end, she said, "Congratulations, you have now completed the North Carolina Algebra 1 End of Course test." Immediately, I felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders as I took a deep breath and told myself, I did it. I made it through. And the best part was I managed to do even better than I expected, as I ended up scoring higher than 96% of the entire state, giving me a 96 on this grade and putting me in the top 3% of the state. Wow. After struggling all year in this class and being on the verge of killing myself, I still managed to do phenomenally, and better than the vast majority of the state and even my school. In fact, I was one of only 5 students at our school who scored this or more, so that really boosted my confidence and made me extremely satisfied. Now, before I get to the rest of my exams, I want to take a little break and talk about my arm, as I had an appointment on May 31st with a pediatrician. So as stated, from late April to about a week before being baptized, I did physical therapy. This was an extremely good, a week after being baptized, sorry. This was an extremely good call on the PA's part, as I regained almost all of my strength on my left arm. While I never regained 100% of my strength back and still can't bend my left arm completely due to how badly I broke it, my left arm still gained the vast majority of its strength back and was getting back to its great shape. So that's what me, Mom, the pediatrician, and his assistant discussed during the session. They of course took an x-ray of my arm and found that it was doing well, and they also examined my arm's movement. Because of it, if it was doing so well, the pediatrician stated that I could go back to swimming competitively in 3 weeks, which made me pretty happy since I was ready to get back to swimming. I'll discuss my return to swimming in part 5, as although it was nice, my coach did not make it so pleasant and would ultimately go on and affect my overall attitude towards swimming. However, the pediatrician still wanted to take one last look at my arm in the future, so we set up one last appointment for that July, and I'll of course explain how it went in part 5. And with that, let's move on to the last month of the school year, being June 2018. Had Future not happened later into this month would have likely been better than April 2018, as so many incredible things happened that I honestly considered the day that I got home from Fuge as the peak of post-depression period part 1. But anyways, I still had a week of school left. So let's get into this last week. The first thing I'll discuss is the English EOG, which we took on Friday, June 1st. Honestly, this EOG was quite forgettable, other than the fact that it was taken online. I do remember that I didn't do so well on this EOG as I did compared to my 6th and 7th grade ones, though. I'm only making a 3, which still isn't bad since I scored higher than I think 64% of the state, and since English is by far my worst subject, and plus, after all the shit that I went through the school year, I was fine taking a 3, since that's really impressive given all the stuff that happened. Then the next Monday on June 4th, we took our Earth Environmental Science in CFE. So our science teacher took all of us who were taking it into her classroom where she administered the test for us. This ended up being a very challenging exam, as the questions were worded really oddly and had a lot of time, the questions didn't make much sense. However, I somehow got really lucky and made a 90 on this thing. Then the next day, we took our last exam of the school year, being the 8th grade science EOG. This exam was honestly super forgettable, as it kinda went just like my 5th grade science EOG. I made a 5 on the second, and scored higher than 94% of the state, so I was still really far ahead and did super well in this test. And with exams being finished, let's talk about my final grades for each class I took. In World History, I made a 96, Spanish, 93, in Algebra 1, an 88, 8th grade Science, 95, English, 91, Art, 100, PE, 97, and Earth Environmental Science, 90. This means that I made an A in every single class other than Algebra 1, all while battling depression for 3/4 of the school year and overwhelming stress. Yeah, I somehow managed to do it and made really good grades. So with that, let's move on to Friday, June 8th. This was the last day of school, last day of the toughest school year ever. Boy, was this a really nice and relieving day. In fact, I even consider this to be one of the best days of my life, although maybe not to the degree as like April 13th and 14th of 2018 or December 10th of 2021. So the last day of school was always a unique day, since not only do we do an award ceremony, but we also had a half day, although our parents could pick us up sooner if they so pleased. Unlike in 7th grade when my parents didn't, Mom did pick me up from school early, as she also attended the award ceremony since she knew how rough of a school year this was for me. Now, before I talk about the award ceremony, I want to talk about probably the funniest face I've ever seen a teacher make. So, we were assigned an About Me in math terms homework for our first day of school. Dale, who was one of the boys I roomed with during the Wilmington trip, did not do the homework. Well, he didn't do it on time. However, he did finish it and decided to hand it to our teacher on the last day of school. So we went over and got me and his other friends, and we went over to our algebra teacher's room. We followed behind him, and as he handed his homework to our teacher, our algebra teacher made probably the funniest face I've ever seen someone make. Like, he was genuinely so surprised that I thought his eyes were gonna fall apart. Eventually, he then started dying laughing as we all joined in. Ultimately, Dale was unable to get credit for this assignment since final grades were already in, but at least we got a good laugh for it. Then a little while later, we had the award ceremony. This ceremony was similar to the one from 7th grade, where they handed awards to us who made the highest grade in their class, as well as end-of-year awards. Additionally, there were other awards like AR awards, aka who scored the most points, perfect attendance, and citizen awards. Now, in 7th grade, I won a ton of rewards. Recapping from part 3, I got an award for the highest grade in my social studies, science, and math classes, as well as for making the highest grade in the entire school on the math VOG. This year, I did not win as many rewards. However, I still managed to win the award for making the highest grade in my world history class, which was a big slap in the face to my world history teacher, who said I wouldn't be successful in his class after quote-unquote forgetting my AR book. I also would have made the highest grade in science had my classes not been switched, according to my science teacher. Now, going back to my world history award, I remember Mom cheering me on louder than anyone as I walked down to receive my award. I didn't know I would be receiving this award, so this was a shock for both of us. Then after awards were over, me and Mom went over and talked to my teachers. We both thanked them for all their help that year and wished them the best of luck for their upcoming year. I'll discuss where my teachers are now in a little bit, since these three were the greatest teachers I had as a student. Afterwards, we talked to my principal and thanked her for everything as well. We also told to her about early college and asked some questions about it, since she was actually the founder and the first principal of that school. She told us about what it all entailed and answered our questions. Afterwards, she wished us good luck. I thanked her once more, and then we made our way outside. Now, Mom was parked near the 8th grade building. As we walked towards her van, I noticed Sebron, Ryan, and Robbie near the entrance to the 8th grade building, so I quickly went over there and talked to them for a bit while Mom waited on me. That's when we had a really good idea. Why not throw our trackers on top of the school? All of us had our trackers on hand, so we got ours out, and on the count of 3, we threw our trackers onto the school and waved, "So long, middle school," and then proceeded to laugh. Mom joined us in laughing since she found it funny too. We didn't get in any trouble since no teacher saw us, but afterwards, I reunited with Mom and my friends waved me on. We then went to Mom's school, where Mom wrapped things up with her students while I goofed off in the computer lab by myself. And with that, I completed 8th grade, the most challenging school year of my academic career. Honestly, even though 8th grade was so difficult, and I almost did not make it through, I still like looking back on the school year just to examine how much I grew. Like, 8th grade me on my first day of school and 8th grade me on my last day of school were almost two completely different people just because of how much I changed. It's really incredible to see just how much I grew from this school year, and even today, with me now being 19 years old and a senior in college, this school year's effects still linger on and will linger on for me for the rest of my life. But what was so cool about me having my mental health struggles this year was that I wasn't alone, as my teachers were also dealing with issues themselves. From my English teacher losing her baby, to my algebra teacher having his heart attack, to my science teacher giving birth, they were all undergoing stress and struggling this school year themselves. And as a result, all of us were doing better today. My English teacher has since adopted 2 children and even had a baby naturally. She also now works with students whose second language is English and helps them perfect their English. My algebra teacher is back to teaching full-time and is still as funny as ever. And my science teacher got through post-pregnancy depression and even got married 2 years later. She would also go on to teach at the early college I went to, and as a result, I actually talked about her again in part 8. And then there's me. I'm now an adult, and I've since graduated with both a high school diploma and an associate's degree, with only one more full school year left until I graduate with a bachelor's degree in accounting with a minor in economics. While my life hasn't been completely easy since my depression ended, especially when I started university, it's definitely been a lot better and I've become a lot wiser. But to make things even better, I took that situation and made something good out of it, from giving my life to Christ to writing and publishing a book about it. I was able to use it for the better, and now I can look back on it and think it all turned out for the better, just as Mom said. So yeah, that's the end of this story time, as well as part 4 of 8 of the extensive reflection project. I hope y'all did enjoy, and be on the lookout for part 5, which will be on the summer of 2018 and my 9th grade school year.